The kingdom of Blackthorn did not fear war. It feared Duke Lucien Ravencroft. Tonight, inside the obsidian towers of Ravencroft Keep, that fear would become justified in ways no one anticipated. Because the most dangerous predator is not the one hunting you. It is the one realizing too late what it has already lost. Stay with me until the end of this story. You will witness the exact moment an empire begins to crumble from a single sentence. Drop your city in the comments and hit that like button because what happens next will redefine everything you thought you knew about power. The grand ballroom of Ravencroft Keep stretched beneath a ceiling painted with the conquests of dead kings. Candlelight from 6 massive chandeliers turned the polished marble floors into mirrors reflecting the cream of Imperial society. Generals in dress uniforms lined the western walls. Ministers clustered near the southern columns. Nobles from every corner of the empire moved through the space like chess pieces waiting for the game to begin. This was the Winter Sovereign Ball, the most important social gathering of the political season, the night where alliances were forged and enemies identified. Duke Lucien Ravencroft stood at the top of the eastern staircase, surveying his domain with the cold precision of a military commander. At 31, he possessed the kind of presence that silenced rooms without effort. 6 feet 3 inches of controlled violence wrapped in an immaculate black coat trimmed with silver thread. Dark hair pulled back from a face that could have been carved from the same stone as his castle. Eyes the color of winter storms. Everything about him communicated danger. Every noble in that ballroom understood the fundamental truth of the Northern Territories. Duke Ravencroft did not negotiate. He dictated terms. He did not forgive slights. He eliminated threats. The man had inherited a fractured duchy at 24 and transformed it into the wealthiest domain in the empire through a combination of political brilliance and ruthless enforcement. They called him the Iron Wolf. Not to his face. Never to his face. Lord Brennan, a minor noble from the eastern provinces, made the mistake of approaching the stairs with too much wine and too little sense. "Lord Brennan, you look nervous," Lucian said without looking at him. His voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made men instinctively straighten their spines. "Your Grace, I merely wanted to congratulate you on another successful harvest season. The grain exports from Ravencroft have been remarkable." Lucian finally turned those storm-gray eyes toward the lesser noble. "Remarkable. Interesting word choice. Do you know what makes those harvests possible, Lord Brennan? Your Grace's excellent land management, certainly." "No. Fear. The tenant farmers know exactly what happens when quotas are not met. Efficiency requires consequences. Remember that." Lord Brennan's face went pale. He bowed quickly and retreated into the crowd like a rabbit escaping a wolf's den. Lucian watched him go with the faintest trace of satisfaction. This was how power functioned, through demonstration, through understanding that every interaction was a lesson in hierarchy. He descended the stairs with measured steps. Nobles parted before him automatically. Women dropped into curtsies. Men bowed with precision. No one met his eyes for longer than a heartbeat. This was control. This was order. This was everything Lucian believed civilization required. Near the western alcove, he spotted Duchess Seraphine Vale Ravencroft, standing beside the refreshment tables, speaking quietly with several ministerial wives. His wife of 7 years. Elegant in a gown of deep emerald that complemented her auburn hair. She held herself with the kind of refined posture that spoke of excellent breeding and better discipline. Seraphine was exactly what a duchess should be. Beautiful enough to reflect well on his status. Intelligent enough to manage household affairs without constant supervision. Socially skilled enough to navigate the brutal politics of court without embarrassing him. She was perfect. Perfectly functional. Lucien had married her for strategic reasons. The Vale family brought valuable trade connections and political alliances. Seraphine brought competence and stability. It had been a logical match, a successful arrangement. He felt no passion for her, but he had never expected passion. Passion was a weakness that destroyed kingdoms. He had seen it happen. Rulers who prioritized desire over duty inevitably lost everything. Seraphine glanced up as he approached. Their eyes met briefly. She smiled with practiced warmth, the kind of smile that looked genuine to everyone watching, but communicated nothing real beneath the surface. "Your Grace," she said softly. The ministers' wives were just discussing the expansion of the northern trade routes. Lucian nodded. An appropriate topic for women. "Have you ensured the household accounts are prepared for the quarterly review?" "Of course. Everything is in order as always." "Good. I will need those reports before the weekends. You will have them tomorrow morning. Efficient, reliable, exactly as a wife should be. Lucian moved past her without further conversation. There was nothing more to discuss. Seraphine understood her role. She performed it adequately. That was sufficient. What Lucian did not see was the brief flicker of something in her eyes as he walked away. Something that might have been hurt, or might have been nothing at all. Because Lucien Ravencroft had never learned to look for pain in the people he believed he owned. Across the ballroom, near the grand entrance, a disturbance rippled through the crowd like wind across water. Heads turned. Conversations paused mid-sentence. The string quartet in the corner faltered for half a measure before recovering. Lady Celestine Marrow had arrived. She entered the ballroom like sunrise breaking over a battlefield. 23 years old, golden hair cascading over bare shoulders. A gown of white silk that clung to curves designed by Providence to torment men. Blue eyes that sparkled with mischief and promise. Every man in that room felt it. That magnetic pull. That intoxicating combination of beauty and danger that made intelligent people do catastrophically stupid things. Lucian felt it too. He stood frozen near the central column as Celestine glided through the crowd, accepting greetings with practiced charm. She moved like music given human form. Graceful, captivating, utterly aware of the effect she created. This was not the first time Lucian had seen her. Lady Celestine had been a fixture at court for the past 3 months since her introduction to society. But tonight something felt different. Tonight she seemed to glow with an almost supernatural radiance. "Your Grace," a voice said beside him. Lucian turned to find Duke Magnus Viridian standing there with a predatory smile. Magnus was Lucian's primary rival in the Imperial Council. A man of similar age and ambition, but less discipline and far more cruelty. "She is magnificent, is she not?" Magnus continued, gesturing toward Celestine with his wineglass. "I have heard rumors that several noble houses are already positioning themselves for marriage negotiations." Lucian kept his expression neutral. "Lady Celestine is certainly accomplished." "Accomplished?" Magnus laughed. "Is that what we are calling it now? The woman has half the empire ready to start wars over her favor, including, if rumors are correct, certain northern dukes who should know better." The implication hung in the air like poison. Lucian met Magnus's eyes with the kind of cold intensity that had made grown men confess to crimes they had not committed. "Careful, Magnus. Rumors spread by jealous men often reveal more about the speaker than the subject." Magnus's smile never wavered. "Of course, Your Grace. I meant no offense. Merely observation." He drifted away into the crowd, leaving Lucian standing alone with thoughts that had no business existing in a married man's mind. But they existed anyway. Because Duke Lucien Ravencroft, the man who prided himself on absolute control, was beginning to lose control of something far more dangerous than territory. He was losing control of himself. The evening progressed with the mechanical precision of all formal gatherings. Dances were executed, toasts were offered. Political alliances were coded into compliments and insults disguised as pleasantries. Seraphine moved through it all with the skill of a master tactician. Lucian watched her from across the room, managing conversations, smoothing over potential conflicts, strengthening relationships with the wives of influential ministers. She was doing exactly what was expected of her, and he felt nothing, no pride, no gratitude, no connection, just the vague awareness that his household machinery was functioning correctly. Then Celestine appeared beside him as if summoned by his wayward thoughts. "Your Grace," she said with a curtsy that managed to be both respectful and subtly provocative. "I wanted to thank you for the invitation tonight. Ravencroft Keep is even more magnificent than described." Her voice carried the faint accent of the southern provinces. Warm, musical, designed to make men forget their obligations. "Lady Celestine, you honor us with your presence." She smiled. "The ballroom seems rather formal. I confess I prefer more intimate gatherings where one can actually converse rather than perform." Lucien found himself responding before his rational mind could intervene. "Perhaps I could show you the northern gallery. The portrait collection is quite remarkable." "I would be delighted, Your Grace." They moved through the crowd toward the side corridor. Lucien was acutely aware of eyes tracking their movement, Magnus smirking from beside the eastern windows, Lord Brennan whispering to a cluster of minor nobles, and Seraphine, standing perfectly still near the refreshment tables, watching her husband escort another woman out of the ballroom with an expression that revealed absolutely nothing. The northern gallery stretched along the third floor, offering views of the snow-covered mountains through tall windows. Portraits of Ravencroft ancestors lined the walls in heavy frames. Dukes and duchesses frozen in oil paint, their eyes seeming to judge the living from their static immortality. Celestine moved along the gallery examining each portrait with apparent fascination. But Lucian suspected she cared nothing for dead nobles. This was a performance, a carefully choreographed dance towards something far more dangerous than art appreciation. "Your family has ruled these lands for generations," she said softly. "That must create enormous pressure. Pressure creates strength. Without it, men become weak." "And what about love, Your Grace? Does love have any place in such a philosophy?" The question struck with unexpected precision. Lucian turned to find her standing close. Too close. Near enough that he could smell her perfume, see the pulse beating at the base of her throat. "Love is a luxury for poets and fools," he said. "Rulers cannot afford such indulgence." Celestine reached out and placed one gloved hand on his chest. How terribly sad. To possess everything and feel nothing. I feel what matters. Control. Order. Achievement. But not desire. The word hung between them like a blade. Lucien should have stepped back. Should have ended this conversation immediately. Should have returned to the ballroom and his wife, and the safe predictability of his carefully constructed life. Instead, he leaned closer. "Desire is weakness." "Then why?" she whispered. "Are you still standing here?" "Because you fascinate me." The admission escaped before he could prevent it. Raw, honest, catastrophically stupid. Celestine smiled. A genuine smile this time, triumphant and tender simultaneously. Finally, she said, "Something real." They stood there at the gallery, surrounded by the painted ghosts of Lucian's ancestors. The snow fell outside the windows. The distant sound of music drifted from the ballroom below. And Duke Lucien Ravencroft, the Iron Wolf, the man who believed emotion was the enemy of power, felt something crack in the fortress he had built around his heart. It was the beginning of the end. He just did not know it yet. The affair began 3 weeks later. Not with dramatic confrontation or passionate abandon, but with quiet meetings, stolen conversations, letters exchanged through loyal servants who understood the price of discretion. Lucian told himself he maintained control, that this was merely a diversion, a brief indulgence that would run its course and leave his carefully ordered life intact. But obsession does not announce itself with trumpets. It arrives quietly, in the thoughts that intrude during council meetings, in the way his heart accelerated when he saw golden hair across a crowded room, in the increasing irritation he felt toward his wife for the crime of existing in a space he wanted someone else to occupy. Seraphine said nothing, not when he started arriving late to dinners, not when he became distant during their required public appearances, not when servants whispered about the Duke's frequent visits to the Marrow estate. She simply continued managing the duchy with the same quiet competence she had always demonstrated. The tenant ledgers remained pristine. The grain shipments departed on schedule. The charitable schools she had secretly established continued educating peasant children with funds from her personal accounts. She held the machinery of Ravencroft together while her husband slowly dismantled the foundation of their marriage. The Winter Sovereign Ball returned 6 months later. The same ballroom, the same nobles, the same pretense of civilization masking the savage politics beneath. But everything had changed. Lucien stood at the top of the eastern staircase with Celestine beside him, not hidden anymore, not relegated to stolen moments in private galleries. She was here, on his arm, where everyone could see. The statement was clear. The scandal was intentional. Seraphine entered this ballroom alone. She wore a gown of deep sapphire that should have made her the most beautiful woman in the room. But beauty means nothing when the man who should notice is deliberately looking elsewhere. She moved through the crowd with her usual grace, accepting greetings, engaging in appropriate conversation, playing the role of Duchess with flawless precision. But Lucian saw the change, the way other noble women looked at her with pity, the way ministers' wives whispered behind raised fans, the way his own allies avoided extended conversation as if adultery were contagious. His wife was being humiliated, and he did not care. Duke Magnus approached halfway through the evening with that same predatory smile. "Quite the bold statement tonight, Lucien. Half the Empire is wondering if you have lost your mind. I have found something more valuable than their approval." "Have you?" Magnus gestured subtly towards Seraphine across the room. Your Duchess has managed this territory with remarkable skill for 7 years. The schools, the trade agreements, the tenant protections, all her work, all her... Yet you parade her replacement like a prize hunting dog. Fascinating strategy. Lady Celestine is not a replacement. She is an awakening. To what? Passion? Desire? How wonderfully romantic. I wonder how romantic you will find it when your duchy falls apart because you were too distracted by a pretty face to notice the foundation crumbling. You forget yourself, Magnus. No, Your Grace. I think you have forgotten yourself, but please, continue down this path. It will make my eventual acquisition of your territories much easier. Magnus walked away, leaving Lucian standing there with rage burning in his chest. But beneath the rage was something else. Doubt. He looked across the ballroom at Seraphine. She was speaking with Minister Aldrich's wife near the western alcove, calm, composed, utterly controlled. Had she always been this strong? Had he simply never noticed? The thought vanished as quickly as it arrived, because Celestine appeared beside him with champagne and that intoxicating smile that made rational thinking impossible. You look troubled, my love. The Minister Aldrich's wife issue has been resolved, but Magnus Viridian continues his usual provocations. Ignore him. You are Duke Ravencroft. He is nothing. The confidence in her voice soothed something in him. This was what he wanted. Someone who made him feel powerful rather than obligated. Someone who chose him rather than being chosen for political convenience. Someone who made him feel alive. At midnight, as was tradition, the Duke was expected to offer a toast before the assembled court. Lucian ascended the central platform with Celestine still beside him. The gesture was deliberately provocative. Traditionally, the Duchess stood with her husband during formal addresses. Seraphine remained near the western alcove, perfectly still, perfectly composed. The ballroom fell silent. Lucien raised his glass. Lords and ladies of the Empire, we gather tonight to celebrate another year of prosperity and strength. Ravencroft continues to lead through discipline and vision. Polite applause rippled through the crowd. But as I stand before you, Lucien continued, I am reminded that true strength requires honest reflection. We are taught to value duty above all else, to prize function over feeling, to build empires on obligation rather than genuine connection. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. This was not typical ceremonial language. Celestine touched his arm gently, a warning or encouragement. Lucien could not tell which. He looked directly at Seraphine across the ballroom. Her green eyes met his without flinching, and something monstrous rose up from the darkest part of his soul, the part that wanted to justify his betrayal, that needed to transform his guilt into her failure, that required her to be insufficient so he could be righteous in his abandonment. I have learned, Lucien said slowly, that some matches are made for political necessity rather than personal fulfillment, that obligation can masquerade as partnership, that a man can possess everything and feel nothing. Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Seraphine's expression did not change, but something flickered behind her eyes, something that might have been the death of hope. Lucien kept speaking. The words poured out like poison. I should have chosen a woman who inspires desire instead of duty, who makes me feel alive rather than adequate, who understands that passion and power are not enemies but allies. The ballroom erupted in shocked whispers. Celestine smiled beside him, triumphant. And across that marble floor, beneath those painted ceilings decorated with the victories of dead kings, Duchess Seraphine Vale Ravencroft did not cry, did not scream, did not collapse in public humiliation as everyone expected. She simply looked at her husband, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time seeing him clearly without the distortion of duty or obligation or the desperate hope that competence would eventually transform into love. And she understood. A ruler who cannot recognize value will eventually destroy everything he owns. Seraphine set down her champagne glass with careful precision. She walked across the ballroom floor with her spine straight and her head high. Every eye tracked her movement. She stopped directly in front of Lucien, close enough that only he could hear her words. You're about to learn a very expensive lesson, Your Grace. The difference between what glitters and what sustains. Then she turned and walked out of the ballroom, out of Ravencroft Keep, out of his life. The nobles stood frozen. No one knew how to respond to a duchess abandoning a ball, abandoning her husband, abandoning everything. Lucien felt Celestine's hand tighten on his arm. You did wonderfully, she whispered. So brave. But as he watched Seraphine's sapphire gown disappear through the ballroom doors, Duke Lucien Ravencroft felt something he had not experienced in over a decade. Fear, not the kind that came from external threats or political rivals, but the kind that comes from realizing you have just made a catastrophic mistake and there is no way to take it back. The winter storm arrived 3 hours later. Snow fell in sheets so thick that visibility beyond the castle walls became impossible. Roads turned to ice. Travel became lethal. Lucian stood in his private study, staring at reports that suddenly made no sense. Numbers that should have been familiar looked foreign. Trade agreements he thought he understood revealed complexities he had never noticed. Because Seraphine had been handling them. All of them. For 7 years. His steward, Edmund, knocked quietly before entering. "Your Grace, the Duchess has departed Ravencroft Keep with your son and 3 personal servants." Lucian's head snapped up. "Departed? In this storm? That is suicide. She took the southern route before the worst of the weather arrived. Our scouts report she reached the crossroads an hour ago. After that, the snow obscured all tracks. Find her. Bring her back immediately." Edmund hesitated. "Your Grace, with respect, the Duchess made her intentions quite clear. She left this." He placed a folded letter on the desk. The Ravencroft seal broken. Seraphine's handwriting elegant across expensive paper. Lucian opened it. The words were brief, devastating. "Lucien, I rebuilt your fractured duchy while you conquered it. I educated the children you ignored. I stabilized the systems you assumed were automatic. I loved a man who saw me as furniture. You wanted passion. I gave you an empire. Now discover what your empire looks like without the foundation you never noticed was supporting it." Lucien read it 3 times. Then he walked to the window and stared out at the storm swallowing the northern roads. And for the first time in his adult life, Duke Lucien Ravencroft, the Iron Wolf, the man who believed control was everything, realized he had just lost control of the only thing that actually mattered. Outside, the wind screamed against the obsidian towers. Inside, the empire began to crack. And somewhere in that frozen darkness, a woman who had spent 7 years being invisible finally became the most dangerous force in the kingdom. Because she was free. The storm lasted 3 days. Lucian spent those 72 hours discovering exactly how much of his empire had been held together by hands he never bothered to notice. The first crisis arrived before dawn on the 2nd day. Edmund knocked on the study door where Lucien had not slept. Surrounded by ledgers he suddenly could not decipher. "Your Grace, we have a situation with the northern grain shipments." "What situation?" "The coordination schedules are missing. The Duchess maintained all transport logistics personally. Without her records, the merchants do not know which routes to take or which warehouses have capacity. 3 convoys are currently stalled at the eastern crossroads waiting for direction." Lucien stared at the steward. "Send them north through the mountain pass." "Your Grace, that route is closed for winter maintenance. The Duchess always redirected shipments through the coastal road during this season. Then send them on the coastal road. The coastal warehouses are at capacity. She negotiated overflow storage with Minister Aldrich's estates months ago. But without the contracts, they will not accept our grain." Lucien felt rage building in his chest, the kind that usually preceded someone's dismissal, or worse. "Then find the contracts. Your Grace, the Duchess kept those records in her private study, which she locked before departing." "Break the lock." Edmund shifted uncomfortably. "Your Grace, breaking into the Duchess's private chambers while she is absent would create a scandal that Magnus Viridian would exploit within hours." The truth of that statement hit like a physical blow. Lucien had spent 7 years believing he ruled through strength and intimidation. He had never realized that half his power came from a woman who made the invisible machinery of governance function while he postured before the court. She had been the engine. He had been the decorative hood ornament. The realization tasted like ash. "Fine," Lucian said through clenched teeth. "Send a rider to Minister Aldrich. Negotiate new terms. In this storm, Your Grace, travel is impossible. Then wait until the roads clear. Your Grace, if the grain sits in those convoys for another week, spoilage will cost us thousands in revenue." The Duchess would have resolved this with 3 letters and 2 meetings by now. Edmund did not say the last part with malice, just exhausted observation, which somehow made it worse. Lucian stood and walked to the window. Snow continued falling in sheets. Somewhere beyond that white curtain, Seraphine was rebuilding a life without him. and his empire was discovering her absence like a body discovering it had been breathing with only one lung. Send word to every merchant house, Lucian said quietly. Offer them 10% above standard rates to handle the logistics themselves. Your Grace, that will establish a precedent. They will expect inflated rates for every future shipment.
Then what do you suggest? Edmund met his eyes. I suggest you bring the Duchess home. Lucian turned back to the window without responding.
Because he could not bring her home. She had not been kidnapped. She had not been coerced. She had walked out of his life with her spine straight and her son in her arms, and every right to do exactly that. And for the first time, Duke Lucien Ravencroft understood the difference between authority and consent. He had possessed the first. He had never earned the second. The duchy began hemorrhaging stability like a wounded animal bleeding across snow. Within the first week, 3 tenant disputes escalated to violence because Seraphine was not there to mediate. She had developed a reputation among the common folk as someone who actually listened, who understood that peasants were people rather than economic units. Without her, the tenants stopped trusting the system. They started hoarding grain, refusing shipments, organizing quiet resistance. Lucian tried solving it the way he solved everything, with threats. He sent soldiers to enforce compliance, arrested the ringleaders, made examples designed to terrify the rest into submission. It backfired catastrophically, because fear only works when people believe they have something left to lose. And peasants who already lived one bad harvest from starvation had nothing left to lose. The riots started on a Tuesday.
Small at first. A few dozen farmers refusing to deliver grain to the northern warehouses. Then hundreds. Then thousands.
Lucian stood in the council chamber facing his ministers with the kind of fury that would have sent them running 6 months ago. How did this happen? How did my duchy descend into chaos in less than 2 weeks? Minister Aldrich, a careful politician who had survived 3 dukes before Lucian, cleared his throat. Your Grace, if I may speak frankly. You may. The common people loved the Duchess. She funded schools for their children, negotiated fair grain prices during harsh winters, intervened personally when landlords became abusive. They did not obey Ravencroft because they feared you. They obeyed because they trusted her. Lucian felt the words like a knife between ribs. Then they will learn to fear me again. Your Grace, Minister Aldrich said carefully, fear is expensive to maintain. Trust is renewable. The Duchess understood that. You do not. The silence in that council chamber became suffocating, because everyone present knew Aldrich had just committed political suicide by telling the Duke an unforgivable truth. Lucian walked slowly around the table until he stood directly behind the minister's chair. When he spoke, his voice carried the lethal quiet that preceded violence. Minister Aldrich,
are you suggesting that a woman managed my territory better than I do?
Aldrich did not flinch. I am suggesting, Your Grace, that your territory was managed by 2 people, one visible, one invisible, and you just exiled the one who actually understood how power functions at the ground level. Get out. Your Grace, get out before I have you arrested for treason. Aldrich stood, bowed with cold precision, and walked out of the council chamber with his dignity intact. The remaining ministers sat frozen. Lucian returned to the head of the table. Does anyone else wish to lecture me about my wife's supposed competence? No one spoke. Good. Then find solutions to the tenant riots. I want order restored within 3 days. The ministers filed out in silence, leaving Lucian alone with the growing realization that he had become emperor of a crumbling kingdom, and the woman who could save it wanted nothing to do with him anymore. Lady Celestine arrived that evening dressed in silk the color of candlelight. She moved through Ravencroft Keep like she owned it, which in some ways she believed she did. Lucien found her in the northern gallery where they had first crossed the line from propriety to betrayal. You look exhausted, my love, she said, touching his face with practiced tenderness. The duchy is experiencing temporary disruptions. Temporary? Darling, the entire empire is whispering about Ravencroft's collapse. Half the noble houses are already positioning themselves to absorb your territories once the emperor declares you incompetent. Lucian stepped back from her touch. The emperor will declare no such thing. Celestine smiled. That confidence is why I adore you. But confidence does not resolve grain shortages or peasant riots. Perhaps you should consider more aggressive measures. What measures? Scorched earth. Burn a few villages. Execute the ringleaders publicly. Remind them why they fear the name Ravencroft. Lucian stared at her. She was serious, completely serious. And for the first time since this affair began, he saw her clearly, not as a goddess, not as salvation from a loveless marriage, but as exactly what she was, a beautiful predator who understood nothing about governance and cared even less. Celestine noticed the change in his expression. "What is wrong? Those villagers are my responsibility. Burning them would destroy any remaining loyalty." "Loyalty?" She laughed. "Darling, you are a duke. You do not need loyalty. You need obedience. They are not the same thing." "Of course they are. The strong rule. The weak submit. That is how civilization functions." Lucian thought about Seraphine, about the schools she funded in secret, the tenant protections she negotiated, the careful diplomacy she conducted while he postured and threatened. Seraphine understood the difference, and he had humiliated her for it. "I need to work," Lucian said quietly. Celestine's eyes narrowed. "You are dismissing me? I have responsibilities." "To a ducky that hates you, to peasants who riot in the streets, or perhaps to a wife who abandoned you?" The last question carried venom. Lucian met her eyes. "Seraphine did not abandon me. I exiled her. Do not rewrite history, darling. You chose me. You declared your feelings before the entire court. You wanted passion instead of duty. Well, here I am, passionate, available, everything you claim to desire." Lucien studied her face. The perfect features, the calculated seduction, the complete absence of anything resembling genuine partnership. "I made a mistake," he said. Celestine went very still. "What did you say?" "I chose badly." "You are saying I was a mistake?" "No. I am saying I destroyed something valuable because I was too arrogant to recognize its worth." Celestine's expression transformed from shock to rage in seconds. "You are going back to her. I do not know if she will accept me. She is a discarded wife." "Of course she will accept you. Women like Seraphine always do. They have no other options." Lucien felt something cold settle into his bones. Women like Seraphine. You mean women with intelligence and competence and actual substance beyond physical beauty? Celestine's face flushed. "I have substance. You have ambition, and there is a difference. How dare you?" "This affair is over, Celestine. Leave Ravencroft Keep by morning." The silence that followed felt dangerous. Celestine stepped closer. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You think you can discard me like a used glove? I am Lady Celestine Marrow. Half the Empire witnessed your devotion. If you abandon me now, I will ensure every noble house knows you are weak, indecisive, ruled by sentiment rather than strength." Lucien looked at her without emotion. "Do what you believe you must, but you will leave my castle tonight. You will regret this. I already regret everything that brought you here." Celestine stared at him for 5 full seconds. Then she turned and walked out of the gallery with her silk gown trailing behind her like a battle standard. Lucien stood alone among the portraits of his ancestors and wondered if any of them had been stupid enough to destroy an empire for a beautiful face and empty promises. He suspected several had. The difference was that he might actually survive long enough to fix it, if Seraphine would let him. Finding her took 2 weeks. Seraphine had vanished more thoroughly than anyone anticipated. No forwarding address, no letters to former associates, no contact with family. She had executed her departure with the same meticulous planning she applied to everything, which meant she did not want to be found. Lucien hired trackers, bribed merchants, sent scouts to every coastal town within 300 miles. He became obsessed with the search in ways that terrified his remaining staff. Because Duke Ravencroft did not beg, did not plead, did not chase after women who rejected him. Yet here he was, doing all 3. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of the peasant children from Seraphine's secret schools, a girl of maybe 12 who appeared at the castle gates asking to speak with the Duke personally. The guards almost turned her away, but something in her determination reminded them of the Duchess. Lucien received her in the smallest receiving room. She stood before him in patched clothing with her chin raised. "Your Grace, I know where the Duchess is. Tell me." The girl met his eyes without fear. "Why should I? You heard her. Everyone knows what you said at the ball." Lucien felt shame twist in his chest. A duke feeling shame before a peasant child. The universe had developed a sense of irony. "Because I want to apologize. Apologies do not rebuild trust, Your Grace. The Duchess taught us that. She said actions matter more than words. Then tell me what action would demonstrate my sincerity. The girl pulled a folded paper from her coat. This is a list of the schools the Duchess funded. They are closing because she cannot send money anymore. If you want to prove you understand what you destroyed, start by protecting what she built. Lucien took the list. 23 schools, scattered across the duchy, everyone funded through Seraphine's personal accounts. I will ensure they remain open. Will you? Or will you forget about them once you get what you want? The question struck with devastating accuracy. This child understood manipulation better than half his ministers. I give you my word. The Duchess said your word is worth exactly what your actions support. She is in Greyhaven, the coastal town 3 days south. She teaches arithmetic to fishermen's daughters in a cottage near the docks. The girl turned to leave. Wait, Lucian called. What is your name? Elara, Your Grace. Thank you, Elara. Do not thank me yet. The Duchess might send you away. She has become very good at recognizing people who do not deserve her time. Then Elara walked out of Ravencroft Keep, leaving Lucian standing there with a list of schools and the uncomfortable realization that a 12-year-old girl had just read him more accurately than anyone at court. Greyhaven smelled like salt and fish and freedom. Lucien arrived on horseback with minimal escort. He had learned that displays of power meant nothing to people who did not depend on his favor. The cottage stood near the eastern docks, small, weathered, so completely unlike Ravencroft Keep that it felt like visiting another world. Through the window, Lucien could see her. Seraphine sat at a rough wooden table surrounded by 6 young girls. She was teaching them mathematics using stones and chalk. Her hair was pulled back simply. Her dress was plain wool rather than silk. She looked more beautiful than he had ever seen her, because she looked free. Lucien knocked on the door. The lesson stopped. Seraphine glanced toward the entrance. When she saw him through the window, her expression did not change. She stood, spoke quietly to the girls. They gathered their materials and filed out past Lucien with curious stares. Then he was alone with his wife for the first time since she had walked out of the Winter Sovereign ball. Seraphine remained standing near the table. She did not invite him inside, did not offer greeting, just waited with the patience of someone who no longer felt obligated to perform courtesy. Lucien stepped through the doorway. The cottage was even smaller inside. One main room, a bedroom visible through a curtained doorway. His son's toys scattered in the corner. This is where you live now, he said. This is where I live freely. The distinction hit like a slap. Lucian moved closer. The duchy is falling apart without you. Good. Good? You built an empire on intimidation and assumed it would sustain itself. Now you are learning that fear is expensive maintenance. I hope the lesson cost you everything. Her voice carried no anger, just cold assessment, which was somehow worse than rage. Seraphina, I made a mistake. One mistake? She laughed without humor. You made 7 years of mistakes, Lucian. Every time you treated me like furniture, every time you took credit for work I did, every time you looked through me as if I were invisible. The ball was just the moment I stopped accepting it. I am sorry. Sorry that I left? Or sorry that the consequences are uncomfortable? Lucian had faced down armies without his hands shaking. But standing in this small cottage before this woman, he had failed so completely he felt his composure crack. I'm sorry that I was too arrogant to see what I had, too obsessed with control to recognize partnership, too frightened of vulnerability to accept love. Seraphine studied him for a long moment. Pretty words, Lucien. Did you rehearse them on the ride here? No. I rehearsed them for 2 weeks while my duchy collapsed and I finally understood what you contributed. And what did I contribute? Everything that mattered. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Seraphine walked to the window. She stared out at the fishing boats bobbing in the harbor. When she spoke, her voice was softer. I loved you, Lucien. For 7 years, I loved a man who saw me as a resource to be managed, rather than a partner to be cherished. I convinced myself that competence would eventually transform into affection, that if I just worked hard enough, you would finally notice me. Seraphine, but you did notice me. Finally, at that ball, you noticed me long enough to publicly declare that I was insufficient, that I lacked passion, that I was duty rather than desire. I was wrong. She turned to face him. You were honest, perhaps for the first time in our marriage. You told the truth about how you saw me, and I am grateful, because it freed me from the delusion that I could earn love from someone incapable of giving it. I am capable. I just did not know how. And you think you know now? After 2 weeks of discomfort? Men like you do not change, Lucien. You adapt temporarily to regain control. Then you revert to what you were.
Lucian felt desperation rising, a feeling he had not experienced since his father died and left him a fractured duchy at 24.
Tell me what I need to do. Whatever it takes. I will do it. Seraphine shook her head. That is the problem. You still think this is a negotiation, a transaction where you offer sufficient payment and receive what you want. But I am not a territory to be reconquered, Lucien. I am a person who left a prison. Ravencroft was not a prison. It was for me. Every day pretending your indifference did not hurt. Every night knowing you would never choose me if given an actual choice. Do you know what that does to someone? To love someone who sees you as useful but undesirable? The pain in her voice finally broke through his defenses. Lucian crossed the room and knelt before her, an alpha duke on his knees before the wife he had humiliated. I see you now, he said quietly. I see everything I was too blind to notice. Your intelligence, your compassion, your strength, the schools you funded, the people you protected, the empire you built while I took credit. Seraphine looked down at him. And Lady Celestine? A mistake born from ego and emptiness. Do you love her? No, I never did. Then what was she? Lucienne met her eyes, a mirror showing me what I wanted to believe about myself, that I was passionate and alive rather than controlling and hollow. And what are you actually? Broken, but trying to rebuild into something better. Seraphine reached down and touched his face. The gesture was not tender, more like a doctor examining a wound. Lucien, she said softly, I do not know if I can trust you again. I will earn it back. Trust is not earned through grand gestures. It is rebuilt through consistent small actions over time, and I do not know if you have the patience for that. I will prove I do. She stepped back, breaking contact. Leave Greyhaven, return to Ravencroft, fix your duchy, protect those schools. Govern with something other than intimidation, and if you can sustain that for a year without me, then perhaps we can discuss whether reconciliation is possible. A year? Yes. Seraphine, the Empire is in crisis. Magnus Viridian is maneuvering to destroy Ravencroft permanently. Then handle it. You are Duke Ravencroft. You have armies and wealth and political power. If you cannot protect your own territory, then you do not deserve it. Lucien stood slowly. You are punishing me. No. I am protecting myself. There is a difference. What about our son? He is safe and happy here. When you demonstrate that Ravencroft is a home rather than a battlefield, we can discuss his return. Lucien felt the walls closing in. Every instinct screamed to assert dominance, to demand obedience, to remind her of vows and obligations. But those instincts had created this disaster. Fine, he said. 1 year. And Lucien? Yes? If you arrive in 11 months with the same arrogance you showed at that ball, I will disappear somewhere even you cannot find me. Understood. He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. Seraphine, I destroyed the affair with Celestine, publicly. She left Ravencroft in disgrace. Seraphine's expression did not change. That was for your benefit, not mine. I do not need revenge, Lucian. I needed freedom, and I have it. Then what would bring you home? Proof that home is worth returning to. Lucian nodded, then he walked out of the cottage into the salt air and mounting wind. Behind him, Seraphine returned to her lesson plans. And for the first time in their marriage, both of them were being completely honest. The ride back to Ravencroft took 3 days. Lucien spent those 72 hours thinking about everything he had taken for granted. The invisible labor, the quiet competence, the sacrifices made by someone he treated as decoration. When he arrived at the castle, Edmund met him in the courtyard. Your Grace, we have a situation. What now? Duke Magnus Viridian has called for an emergency session of the Imperial Council. He is bringing formal charges against Ravencroft. What charges? Incompetent governance, Your Grace. He has documented the grain shortages, the peasant riots, the administrative collapse. He is arguing before the Emperor that your territory should be redistributed to more capable rulers. The hearing is scheduled for next month. Lucien dismounted. His exhaustion transformed into something sharper, Because Magnus had made a critical mistake. He had given Lucien a deadline, and the Duke Ravencroft who returned from Greyhaven was not the same man who had humiliated his wife at a ball. This version understood what he was fighting for. Not pride, not ego, but the chance to become worthy of a woman who deserved far better than what he had given her. "Summon the ministers," Lucian said. "Every single one, including Aldrich." "Your Grace, you dismissed Minister Aldrich. I was wrong." "Bring him back. Offer him a public apology and increased authority." Edmund stared. "Your Grace? I am restructuring how power functions in Ravencroft, starting now." He walked into the castle, leaving his steward standing in the courtyard with an expression of complete shock. Because Duke Lucien Ravencroft had just done something he had never done before. He admitted he was wrong, and that admission would change everything. The council meeting began at dawn. Every minister sat around the table with visible tension. They had watched their duke descend into obsession and instability. They expected purges or paranoia. Instead, Lucien stood before them without armor or pretense. "Gentlemen, I have been a catastrophically inadequate leader." No one spoke. "I believed control equaled competence, that fear generated loyalty, that my wife's contributions were supplemental rather than foundational. I was wrong about all of it." Minister Aldrich cleared his throat. "Your Grace, this is an unexpected development. Save the politics, Aldrich. You were right. Seraphine managed half this duchy while I postured before the court. Without her, we are collapsing. So we are going to rebuild. But differently this time." He placed Seraphine's list of schools on the table. "These institutions remain open, fully funded, with expansions to every village that requests them. Your Grace, the Treasury, will prioritize people over palaces. We start with education, then tenant protections, then healthcare systems." The ministers exchanged glances. This was not Duke Ravencroft. This was revolution disguised as governance. Furthermore, Lucien continued, "I am establishing an independent civilian council with authority over agricultural policy, trade negotiations, and social welfare. They report directly to the Duchess upon her return." Minister Aldrich leaned forward. "Your Grace, the Duchess has not returned. She will. If we prove Ravencroft is worth returning to, and if she refuses, then we govern as though she were here anyway, because her methods worked and mine did not." The room fell silent. Lucian met each minister's eyes. "Duke Magnus believes Ravencroft has failed. He will argue before the Emperor that I am incompetent. He is partially correct, but I am learning, and we have 1 month to demonstrate that this duchy can function without intimidation." Questions? Minister Aldrich raised one hand. "Your Grace, this will require you to surrender significant personal authority." "I know. Alpha Dukes do not surrender authority willingly. This one does, because I finally understand the difference between power and leadership." The ministers sat frozen. Then Aldrich smiled, the first genuine expression Lucian had seen from him in months. "Well then, Your Grace, let us rebuild an empire." The month that followed transformed Ravencroft in ways that shocked the entire empire. Schools reopened with expanded curriculums. Tenant protection laws were codified into permanent policy. Trade routes were reorganized based on efficiency rather than intimidation. The Civilian Council began meeting weekly with actual authority, and Duke Lucien Ravencroft, the Iron Wolf, became something far more dangerous than a tyrant. He became effective. Word spread through the noble houses like fire through dead grass. Ravencroft was stabilizing. The peasant riots had stopped. The grain shipments were functioning. The duchy that Magnus had declared doomed was quietly becoming more prosperous than ever, because it was governed by partnership rather than domination. The Crimson Assembly arrived with the weight of imperial judgment. The grand marble chamber of the Imperial Palace filled with every significant noble house in the empire. Dukes and ministers and generals gathered beneath banners representing centuries of aristocratic power. At the head of the room sat Emperor Constantine himself, 70 years old, shrewd, capable of mercy and cruelty in equal measure. Duke Magnus Viridian stood before the throne with documented evidence of Ravencroft's failures. "Your Imperial Majesty," he began with theatrical gravity, "I bring charges of incompetent governance against Duke Lucien Ravencroft. The evidence is overwhelming. Grain shortages, peasant riots, administrative collapse." His territory descended into chaos within weeks of his wife's departure. He is unfit to rule. Magnus presented his documentation with the confidence of a predator who believed victory was certain. Then Lucien stood. He wore no decorative armor, no ceremonial weapons, just the simple formal code of his house. Your Imperial Majesty, I do not dispute Duke Magnus's evidence. The failures he describes occurred exactly as documented. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Magnus smiled. But Lucien continued speaking. Those failures taught me what 7 years of unchallenged authority could not. That governance requires more than intimidation. That loyalty must be earned rather than demanded. That the people are not resources to be exploited, but citizens to be served. He placed a different set of documents before the Emperor. These are the results of 30 days governing under new principles. Education expansion. Tenant protections. Civilian oversight. Transparent trade agreements. Ravencroft is now more stable and prosperous than any period under my previous methods. Emperor Constantine leaned forward. You admit your failures publicly? Yes, Your Majesty. And claim to have corrected them in 1 month? I claim to have begun correcting them. The work will take years. Then why should I believe this is genuine reform rather than temporary performance? Lucien met the Emperor's eyes. Because I am transferring permanent authority over civilian welfare, agricultural policy, and educational systems to an independent council overseen by Duchess Seraphine Ravencroft. The chamber erupted in chaos. No Alpha Duke in Imperial history had voluntarily divided governance with a woman. Magnus shot to his feet. This is madness. He is abandoning tradition. No, Lucian said calmly. I am acknowledging that my wife governed better than I did, and I am codifying that reality into permanent structure. Emperor Constantine raised one hand. Silence fell. Duke Ravencroft, you understand what you are proposing? You are creating a dual authority structure that violates centuries of precedent. Yes, Your Majesty, because precedent built empires on the backs of people who deserved better. I am choosing effectiveness over tradition, and if the Duchess refuses to return, then the civilian council governs in her stead. Either way, Ravencroft continues under principles that prioritize people over pride. The Emperor studied him for a long moment. Then he smiled. Duke Magnus, your charges are dismissed. Duke Ravencroft has demonstrated more wisdom in 30 days than most nobles achieve in a lifetime. This council finds no basis for redistribution. Magnus went pale. Your Majesty, this sets a dangerous precedent. It sets a necessary one, the Emperor said. Dismissed. The nobles filed out in shocked silence. Lucian stood alone in that marble chamber and realized he had just crossed a threshold from which no ruler could return. He had chosen truth over pride, and truth came with consequences he could not yet imagine. Outside the palace, snow began falling across the capital, and 300 miles south, in a coastal cottage, Seraphine received word of what her husband had done before the entire imperial court. She sat at her rough wooden table reading the letter 3 times. Then she looked at her son playing with carved ships near the fireplace. And for the first time since that terrible ball, Duchess Seraphine Vale Ravencroft considered the possibility that some men actually could change, if the price was high enough, and the stakes mattered more than ego. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Lucian sat in his study reviewing the new civilian council reports when Edmund entered with an expression that immediately signaled trouble. Not the usual administrative chaos. Something worse. Your Grace, this came by private courier, marked urgent and confidential. Lucian broke the seal. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, unfamiliar. He read it once, then again, then a third time as his blood turned to ice water. The words were simple, devastating. Duke Ravencroft, you have been extraordinarily naive. While you performed your little redemption theater before the Imperial court, actual power shifted beneath your feet. Your wife will never return to Ravencroft. Not because she lacks forgiveness, but because she lacks the freedom to make that choice. Some debts cannot be negotiated. Some chains cannot be broken by pretty speeches about reform. If you want to see your family again, come to the Blackmir fortress alone. You have 3 days. Tell no one. Bring no army. Or the Duchess and your son disappear permanently into places even emperors cannot reach. Burn this letter. It was unsigned. But the threat was precisely calibrated to exploit every vulnerability Lucian had spent the last month exposing. His hand shook, an alpha duke whose hands never trembled. But rage and terror mixed into something that bypassed rational thought entirely. "Your Grace?" Edmund's voice seemed distant. "Is everything acceptable?" Lucian forced his expression neutral. "A minor issue with southern trade routes. Nothing urgent." He folded the letter carefully, slipped it into his coat pocket, met Edmund's eyes with the kind of false calm that had convinced ministers and enemies for years. "Clear my schedule for the next week. Tell the Council I am conducting personal inspections of the border territories. Your Grace, the Crimson Assembly follow-up meetings will proceed without me. Minister Aldrich has authority to represent Ravencroft." Edmund hesitated, then bowed. "As you command, Your Grace." The steward left. Lucien sat alone in the study as afternoon light slanted through the windows. Outside, Ravencroft functioned with the new efficiency he had built. The schools operated. The civilian council met. The reforms he implemented continued transforming the duchy exactly as he promised. And none of it mattered, because someone had taken Seraphine and his son, had them hidden somewhere beyond his reach, and was using them as leverage for purposes not yet revealed. The old Lucien would have mobilized his army immediately, would have torn the Empire apart hunting for whoever dared threaten House Ravencroft. But the new Lucian understood something the old version never learned. Sometimes overwhelming force creates exactly the disaster you are trying to prevent. Whoever wrote that letter knew him well enough to predict both versions, the tyrant who would rage, and the reformed man who would comply to protect what he loved. They had engineered a trap with no good options. Lucian pulled the letter from his pocket and read it again. The handwriting was educated, noble, female. The phrasing suggested someone who understood court politics intimately, not a random kidnapper, someone from inside his world. He walked to the fireplace and held the letter over the flames as instructed. Then he pulled it back, because burning evidence was something the old Lucian would do. The man who believed following rules mattered more than surviving the game. The new Lucian needed every advantage. He locked the letter in his private safe, then began preparing for a journey that would likely end in violence or worse. Because the thing about transformation is that it never happens completely. The wolf might learn new behaviors, but the teeth remained sharp beneath the civilized smile. And whoever had taken his family was about to discover that reform does not mean harmless. The ride to Blackmir Fortress took 2 days through mountain passes that grew progressively more isolated. Lucian traveled alone as instructed. No guards, no weapons visible, just a man on horseback moving through wilderness that could hide 1,000 threats. He used the time to think through every possibility. Who benefits from Seraphine's disappearance? Who gains leverage by holding her hostage? Who understands the Imperial politics well enough to exploit this specific moment? Duke Magnus was the obvious answer, but Magnus operated through legal maneuvering and political pressure. Kidnapping was too crude for his methods. Lady Celestine had motive for revenge, but she lacked the resources and connections for an operation this sophisticated. The Dowager Duchess Octavia, Lucien's own mother, had been pressuring him to remarry strategically, but she would never endanger her grandson, which left possibilities that Lucian did not want to consider. Enemies he had made through years of ruthless governance, families he destroyed, rivals he crushed. The list was long and brutal. And any one of them might have decided that the best revenge against Duke Ravencroft was destroying everything he finally learned to value. The fortress appeared on the 3rd day like a wound in the landscape. Blackmir had been abandoned for decades after a plague killed its garrison. The towers stood broken against storm clouds. The walls crumbled in sections. It was the kind of place where violence happened away from witnesses. Perfect for an ambush. Lucian dismounted at the outer gate. The courtyard beyond stretched empty and silent. Wind moved through broken windows like the breathing of something dead. He walked forward with every sense alert, scanning for movement, listening for footsteps, calculating escape routes even though he knew there probably were none. The main hall waited ahead, massive doors hanging open like a mouth. Lucien stepped inside. The interior was surprisingly intact, furniture covered in dust, tapestries rotted on walls, chandeliers hanging crooked from ceilings marked by water damage. And at the far end of the hall, sitting in a high-backed chair like a throne, was the last person Lucien expected to see. Dowager Duchess Octavia Ravencroft, his mother. She wore traveling clothes rather than formal gowns, her silver hair pulled back severely. Her expression carried the kind of cold calculation that Lucian recognized because he had inherited it.
"Mother," he said quietly, "what is this?" Octavia stood with the grace of someone half her age. "This, my son, is an intervention."
Where is Seraphine? Safe. For now. Lucian felt rage building in his chest, the old familiar fury that preceded violence. If you have harmed her, I have protected her. From you. From your pathetic attempt at reformation that will inevitably fail and destroy our house permanently. She walked down the hall toward him, each step deliberate.
"You humiliated yourself before the Imperial court," she continued. "Surrendered authority to a woman. Admitted weakness publicly. Do you understand what you have done?"
You have made Ravencroft vulnerable to every ambitious house in the Empire. I made Ravencroft stronger. You made it soft. And softness gets devoured by the strong.
Lucian studied his mother's face, searching for the woman who had raised him. But she had always been this, cold, strategic, willing to sacrifice anything for House Ravencroft's power, including her own son's happiness. "Where is my son?" he asked. "Hidden, where you cannot find him without my cooperation." "Why?" "Because you need to remember who you are. You are not some reformed romantic. You are Duke Lucien Ravencroft, the Iron Wolf, the man who conquered a fractured duchy through strength and fear.
That is your nature. And nature cannot be changed by guilt or sentiment." Lucian felt something shift in his understanding of the situation. This was not a kidnapping. This was an attempted correction.
His mother genuinely believed she was saving him from himself, which made it infinitely more dangerous.
Because Octavia was not a simple villain. She was a true believer in the philosophy that had governed House Ravencroft for generations. Power through domination, survival through ruthlessness, sentiment as weakness. She had raised him to be exactly what he became, and now she was watching him unmake himself. To her, that was betrayal. "Mother, listen to me carefully. Seraphine made Ravencroft function. The schools, the trade agreements, the civilian welfare, all of it. I was too arrogant to see it. I saw it perfectly well," Octavia said. "Your wife was competent, useful. She performed her function adequately. But you should have kept her in that role while maintaining your authority publicly. Instead,
You weakened yourself by admitting dependence. That is not weakness. That is honesty. Honesty is a luxury for those with secure power. You do not have secure power, Lucian. Duke Magnus may have lost this battle, but he is already preparing for the next war. And when he strikes, you will need to be the Iron Wolf again. Not this domesticated version begging for his wife's forgiveness."
Lucien stepped closer.
"Where are they?"
"First, you agree to my terms."
"Which are?"
"You send Seraphine a letter ending the marriage permanently. You remarry strategically within 6 months. You dissolve the civilian council. You return to governing as you did before this catastrophic lapse in judgment. And if I refuse, then your wife and son remain hidden. You can tear the empire apart searching, but you will never find them. I have allies you do not know about, resources you cannot touch. I can keep them away from you indefinitely." The threat was real. Octavia had been playing Imperial politics since before Lucian was born. She had connections that predated his authority. "You would destroy your own grandson's future for this? I would protect it. That boy deserves a father who rules rather than grovels. I will raise him myself if necessary. Teach him what you apparently forgot." Lucian felt the trap closing. Every option led to catastrophe. Comply, and he became the tyrant again. Refuse, and he lost his family permanently. Fight, and Octavia disappeared them somewhere even torture could not reveal. There was a kind of terrible elegance to it. His mother had engineered a situation where both his old nature and his new convictions led to destruction. Unless he found a third option. Lucian took a breath, then another, forcing himself to think past rage and fear. What his mother had not anticipated was that transformation had taught him something the old Lucian never understood. That strength was not the absence of vulnerability. It was the courage to be vulnerable strategically. "Mother," he said quietly, "you are right about one thing. I was the Iron Wolf. I did rule through fear, and it nearly destroyed everything I built." Octavia's expression shifted, calculating. "But you are wrong about nature being unchangeable," Lucian continued. "I have changed. Not into someone weak,
into someone strong enough to admit mistakes and learn from them. Pretty speech, but irrelevant to, I am not going to fight you. What? I am not going to threaten you or rage at you or attempt to force compliance through intimidation, because that is what the old Lucian would do. And the old Lucian is exactly what created this disaster. Then what are you going to do? Lucien met her eyes. I'm going to trust my wife. Octavia went very still. Explain. Seraphine is brilliant, more politically sophisticated than you give her credit for. If she is being held against her will, she will find a way to signal her location. If she is safe as you claim, she will make contact when she chooses. Either way, I trust her judgment more than I trust my own impulses. That is absurd. You are a duke. You do not wait passively. I wait strategically. Because every action I take that mirrors my old behavior proves your point, that I have not actually changed, that reformation was performance. Octavia's expression hardened. You're gambling with your family. No. I am demonstrating faith in my wife's competence. Something I should have done 7 years ago. The silence in that ruined hall stretched thin. His mother had prepared for violence, for threats, for the Duke Ravencroft who broke obstacles through overwhelming force. She had not prepared for a son who refused to play the game according to her rules. You will lose everything, she said finally. Perhaps. Or perhaps I will gain the one thing that actually matters. The chance to become someone worthy of the family. I failed. Octavia stared at him for a long moment. Then she turned and walked toward the shadows at the far end of the hall. You disappoint me, Lucien. I know. But I no longer need your approval to know my value. She paused at the doorway. When Duke Magnus comes for Ravencroft again, and he will, do not expect me to defend you. I would not insult you by asking. Octavia disappeared into the darkness. Lucian stood alone in the ruined fortress, listening to wind move through broken stone. He had just refused his mother's ultimatum, had gambled his family's safety on faith rather than force. It was either the bravest decision he had ever made or the stupidest, and he would not know which until it was far too late to change course. The return journey to Ravencroft took 3 days through increasingly hostile weather. Snow fell in sheets. Wind cut through his coat like blades. By the time Lucien reached the castle gates, he was half frozen and completely exhausted. Edmund met him in the courtyard with obvious relief. Your Grace, we were growing concerned. The storms? I am fine. Any word from the coastal territories? Nothing, Your Grace. The scouts report Greyhaven remains quiet. Lucian nodded. That could mean Seraphine was still safely hidden in the cottage. Or it could mean Octavia had already moved her somewhere else entirely. He would not know until Seraphine chose to reveal herself. If she ever did. The duchy continued functioning with disturbing efficiency in his absence. The Civilian Council had handled 3 tenant disputes, negotiated a new trade agreement with the eastern provinces, and expanded 2 of the schools without requiring his direct involvement. It was exactly what Lucian had designed. A system that functioned through distributed authority rather than centralized control. But it also meant he was becoming less essential to Ravencroft's operation, which was either progress or obsolescence depending on perspective. Minister Aldrich arrived for their weekly briefing looking cautiously optimistic. Your Grace, the Imperial Court has sent formal acknowledgement of our governance reforms. Several other duchies are apparently considering similar civilian council structures. Lucien felt grim satisfaction. Change through example rather than force. Seraphine would approve, if she were here. Excellent work, Minister Aldrich. Continue documenting the results. We need evidence that this approach succeeds long-term. Of course, Your Grace. There is one other matter. Yes? The Dowager Duchess has requested formal cessation of her annual stipend from Ravencroft's treasury. Lucian looked up sharply. When did this happen? The letter arrived this morning. She claims to have secured independent financial arrangements and no longer requires House Ravencroft's support. It was a message, Octavia severing her formal connection to his duchy, declaring independence from his authority, which meant she was preparing for something that required separation from Ravencroft's resources and reputation. Grant her request, Lucian said quietly, and have our intelligence network monitor her movements. Your Grace, spying on your own mother is necessary when that mother just threatened my family. Do it discreetly, but do it. Aldrich bowed. As you command. The minister left. Lucien stood at the window, staring out at snow-covered mountains. somewhere beyond those peaks.
Seraphine was making calculations about whether her husband's transformation was genuine or temporary performance, and Octavia was maneuvering towards some objective Lucian could not yet see. He was caught between the two most formidable women he had ever known, one he loved, one who raised him, and both of them were testing whether he had actually changed or simply adapted temporarily to regain control. The answer would determine everything. 3 weeks passed in tense stability. Ravencroft continued its reformation. The schools flourished. The civilian council gained confidence. Trade improved. The tenant populations began trusting the system again. And Lucian waited, not passively. He continued governing, implementing reforms, building the kind of duchy that Seraphine had always envisioned. But he did not search for her, did not send scouts to force contact, did not attempt to compel her return through any mechanism, because that would prove Octavia right. That transformation was just another form of control. Instead, he built something worth returning to, and trusted that Seraphine would recognize it when she was ready. The message arrived on a cold morning in early spring, a simple letter delivered through normal postal routes. No secret courier, no dramatic revelation. Just Seraphine's handwriting on standard paper. Lucian opened it alone in his study. The words were brief, careful. Lucian, I have been watching Ravencroft from a distance. The school expansions, the civilian council decisions, the trade reforms. Either you have committed to the longest con in Imperial history, or you have actually changed. I am not certain which. Your mother visited me 6 weeks ago. She offered me substantial financial independence in exchange for remaining away from Ravencroft permanently. She believes you will revert to your old patterns once the pressure of my absence eases. I did not accept her offer, but I did not refuse it either, because I am still deciding whether the man who governed Ravencroft for the past 3 months is who you actually are or who you think you need to be temporarily. I need more time. Our son is safe and well. Do not attempt to find us. When I am certain, I will contact you again. Until then, continue proving that change is permanent rather than strategic. S. Lucian read the letter 5 times. Relief that they were safe mixed with frustration that Seraphine still doubted him. But beneath both emotions was something else. Respect, because his wife was not making this easy. Was not accepting pretty words or reformed behavior as sufficient proof. She was demanding sustained transformation over time, which was exactly what someone should demand from a man who had spent 7 years treating her as invisible. He walked to his desk and wrote a response. Kept it brief. Seraphine, I understand your caution. Take whatever time you need. I will continue building a Ravencroft worthy of your partnership. Not to manipulate your return, but because it is the right way to govern, regardless of personal outcome. The schools now serve 800 children. The civilian council just negotiated grain prices that favor tenants rather than landlords. We implemented healthcare subsidies for families who cannot afford treatment. This is not performance. This is who I am becoming, with or without you. Though I desperately hope it is with you, L. He sent it through the same postal route she had used. Then he returned to the work of transformation. Because the cruelest truth about genuine change is that it requires consistency without guarantee of reward. You cannot prove transformation through a single dramatic gesture, only through thousands of small decisions made when no one is watching. And Seraphine was watching, from wherever she had hidden herself, judging whether the Iron Wolf had actually evolved or just learned to wear sheep's clothing more convincingly. The answer would determine the future of House Ravencroft and the fate of the most important relationship in Lucian's life. 2 months later, the crisis Octavia predicted finally arrived. Duke Magnus Viridian moved against Ravencroft with the kind of coordinated assault that required months of preparation. He had been building alliances while Lucian reformed his duchy, gathering nobles who resented the civilian council precedent, organizing military resources under the pretense of border defense. And when he struck, it was not through legal challenges. It was through outright rebellion. The attack began at dawn. Magnus's forces seized 3 border fortresses simultaneously. His allied houses blocked trade routes. His agents spread propaganda claiming that Ravencroft's reforms had made the duchy weak and vulnerable. It was a coordinated military and political campaign designed to force Imperial intervention. Edmund burst into Lucian's study with reports of the incursions. Your Grace, we have confirmation. Duke Magnus has declared you unfit to govern and is petitioning the Emperor to redistribute Ravencroft's territories to more traditional leadership. Lucien stood slowly. How many forces did he commit? Approximately 4,000 soldiers across 3 fronts. He has support from Duke Alderon and Duchess Matthias. This is not a raid, Your Grace. This is a full territorial war. The old Lucian would have responded with overwhelming violence, would have mobilized every soldier, would have made an example so brutal that Magnus's bones would serve as warning markers for decades. But the new Lucian understood something the old version never learned, that some battles are won by refusing to fight them the way your enemy expects. Summon the civilian council, Lucian said, and prepare a formal petition to the Imperial court. Your Grace, we are under attack. This requires military response. It requires strategic response, which is not always military. Edmund stared. Your Grace, if we do not defend the border fortresses, Magnus will claim we surrendered through weakness. Then let him claim it, while we demonstrate something far more powerful than territorial defense. What could possibly be more powerful than protecting our lands? Lucian met his steward's eyes, proving that our reforms work even under pressure. The civilian council met within the hour. Every member arrived looking terrified. They understood that Magnus's attack was specifically designed to destroy the governance model they represented. Lucian stood before them without armor or weapons. Counselors, he began, Duke Magnus has invaded our territory, claiming that our reforms have made Ravencroft weak. He believes civilian oversight creates vulnerability. That distributed authority prevents effective defense. He is wrong, and we are going to prove it. How, Your Grace? One counselor asked. We have no military authority? You have economic authority, trade authority, social welfare authority. Use them. For what purpose? To show the Empire that strength comes from people, not just soldiers. Over the next 72 hours, Ravencroft executed a strategy that no duchy had ever attempted. The Civilian Council coordinated with tenant populations to relocate civilians away from combat zones. They negotiated with neutral merchant houses to maintain supply lines around Magnus's blockades. They sent formal documentation to the Imperial court demonstrating that Ravencroft's governance continued functioning despite military pressure. And they did something even more radical. They opened the schools in occupied territories. Magnus's soldiers arrived in border villages expecting terrified peasants and easy conquest. Instead, they found children sitting in classrooms learning mathematics. Teachers calmly continuing lessons despite military presence. The optics were devastating. Magnus looked like a tyrant attacking education. Ravencroft looked like a duchy so confident in its principles that it refused to let war interrupt civilian welfare. The Imperial court received reports hourly. Emperor Constantine watched the situation develop with increasing fascination, because Duke Ravencroft was fighting a war without traditional warfare, and somehow winning. Magnus grew desperate. He escalated violence, burned a village to force reaction. It backfired completely. The atrocity galvanized neutral houses against him. Nobles who had been considering alliance suddenly withdrew support. The emperor sent formal censure. And through it all, Lucian did not mobilize his full military force, did not retaliate with the overwhelming brutality everyone expected. He simply continued governing, kept the schools open, maintained the civilian council, protected his people through systems rather than soldiers. It was a kind of warfare the Empire had never seen, and it was working. 3 weeks into the conflict, Magnus made his final mistake. He attempted to assassinate a member of Ravencroft's civilian council to destabilize the governance model. The assassination failed, but the attempt was witnessed by Imperial observers. Emperor Constantine summoned both dukes to the capital immediately. The confrontation happened in the same marble chamber where Lucian had previously faced charges of incompetence. But this time, everything was different. Magnus stood before the emperor covered in military decorations and righteous fury. Your Imperial Majesty, Duke Ravencroft has abandoned every principle of noble governance. He has surrendered authority to peasants. He has refused to defend his territory through proper military response. He has made himself, and by extension the entire empire, vulnerable to external threats. Lucian stood calmly in simple formal dress. Your Imperial Majesty, Duke Magnus invaded my territory, murdered my citizens, and attempted assassination of civilian officials. Yet Ravencroft not only survived but continued functioning throughout his assault. Our schools remained open, our trade continued, our people stayed protected. I submit that we have demonstrated a new model of strength, one that does not require constant warfare to maintain authority. Emperor Constantine leaned forward. Duke Ravencroft, you did not deploy your full military capacity. Why? Because overwhelming force would have validated Duke Magnus's claim that traditional military power is the only legitimate strength. I wanted to prove that governance through partnership is more resilient than governance through intimidation. The Emperor studied him for a long moment. And you believe this sincerely? This is not simply tactical positioning? Lucien took a breath. Your Imperial Majesty, 6 months ago I humiliated my wife publicly because I believed passion and duty were incompatible. I have since learned that I was catastrophically wrong about almost everything, including how power actually functions. This reformation is genuine, and it will continue regardless of territorial outcome. The chamber fell silent. Then Emperor Constantine smiled, the same expression he had worn when dismissing Magnus's previous charges. Duke Magnus, your invasion is hereby declared unlawful aggression. You will withdraw all forces from Ravencroft territories immediately. You will pay reparations for damages, and you will submit to formal censure before this court. Your Majesty. Additionally, the Emperor continued, Ravencroft's governance model is now formally recognized as legitimate alternative authority structure. Any future duchy may adopt civilian council systems without imperial interference. Magnus went pale. Your Majesty, this sets a precedent that will undermine noble authority across the empire. Good, the Emperor said. Noble authority that requires constant warfare to maintain is expensive and unstable. Duke Ravencroft has demonstrated that alternative models can function effectively. This court supports innovation over tradition when innovation proves superior. He stood. Ending the session. Both dukes are dismissed. Lucian walked out of that marble chamber into spring sunlight, feeling something he had not experienced in months. Hope. Not because he had won a political battle, but because he had proven that transformation could survive pressure. That change was not just performance when comfortable, but genuine evolution of character. And somewhere, he knew Seraphine was watching, deciding whether what she witnessed was theater or truth. The answer arrived 3 days later. Lucian stood in Ravencroft's courtyard reviewing reconstruction plans with Minister Aldrich when the gates opened. A simple carriage entered. No formal escort, no ceremonial announcement. Just Seraphine stepping down onto the cobblestones with their son in her arms. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue, her hair pulled back simply. No jewelry, no decoration. She looked exactly as she had the day she left, except for her eyes. Those green eyes that had watched him fail and transform and struggle toward becoming something better than what he was. Lucien walked forward slowly, afraid that moving too quickly would shatter whatever fragile possibility existed in this moment. They stood facing each other across 10 feet of courtyard. Seraphine spoke first. I watched you refuse to fight Magnus the way everyone expected. I watched you maintain the reforms under pressure. I watched you choose principles over pride even when it looked like you would lose everything. Lucian waited, not defending, not explaining, just listening. Your mother told me you would revert to the Iron Wolf the moment things became difficult, Seraphine continued. She was wrong. You became something else entirely. Something I did not think was possible. What did I become? A partner. Finally. The word hit with devastating gentleness. Seraphine walked forward, closed the distance between them. I am not returning because you performed adequately. Lucien, I am returning because you transformed genuinely, and I want to rebuild Ravencroft together. As equals this time. Lucian felt his throat tighten. I do not deserve this. No, you do not, but you might deserve it eventually if you continue this trajectory. She smiled, the first real smile he had seen from her in over a year. So let us see if an Alpha Duke can actually sustain partnership long term. Without relapsing into domination, Lucian reached out carefully, touched her face with the reverence of someone handling something precious and fragile. I will spend the rest of my life proving I can. Good, Seraphine said, because I will spend the rest of mine holding you accountable. Their son squirmed between them, making small noises of impatience. And across the courtyard, the ministers and servants of House Ravencroft watched their Duke and Duchess reunite with the understanding that they were witnessing something rare. Not a happy ending, but a difficult beginning. The start of partnership forged through failure and rebuilt through humility. The kind of bond that only survives when both people choose each other with full knowledge of each other's flaws.
That evening, Lucien, and Seraphine stood together in the northern gallery where this disaster had begun, the same portraits of dead Ravencrofts staring down in judgment. "Do they approve?" Seraphine asked, gesturing toward the paintings. Lucian studied his ancestors' frozen faces. "Probably not. I violated every tradition they established." "Good. Those traditions built empires on suffering." She took his hand, a simple gesture that felt profound after everything that had broken between them. "Lucian, what happens when the next crisis arrives? When pressure builds and instincts tell you to dominate rather than collaborate?" "Then you remind me who I am trying to become. And I listen, because I finally understand that strength is not the absence of weakness. It is the courage to acknowledge weakness and adapt." Seraphine leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "We are going to fail sometimes," she said quietly. "Partnership is messy. We will argue, make mistakes, hurt each other unintentionally. I know, but if we commit to repairing damage instead of pretending it does not exist, we might build something stronger than what we had before." Lucien kissed the top of her head. "We will build something better, because we are starting from honesty instead of obligation." They stood together in that gallery as night fell across Ravencroft. The duchy continued functioning around them. Schools remained open. The civilian council prepared for their next session. The people went about their lives with the cautious optimism of citizens who finally trusted their government. And in the capital, Emperor Constantine made a note in his private records about the unprecedented transformation of Duke Lucien Ravencroft, from tyrant to partner, from domination to collaboration, from the Iron Wolf to something far more dangerous to the old order. A man who proved that power could evolve without destroying itself. The note concluded with a single observation that would echo through Imperial history. True strength is not the refusal to change. It is the courage to change completely when change becomes necessary for survival. Duke Ravencroft learned that lesson the hardest way possible, by losing everything, and discovering that what he rebuilt was worth infinitely more than what he destroyed. Peace lasted exactly 47 days. Lucien should have known better, should have recognized that transformation creates vacuums that predators rush to fill. But he had allowed himself the dangerous luxury of hope, had believed that proving his reformation before the Imperial court would discourage further aggression. He was wrong. The warning came on a Tuesday morning through channels so corrupted that Lucien almost missed it entirely. A minor functionary in the Imperial Postal Service. A man Seraphine had helped years ago when his daughter needed medical treatment the family could not afford. He arrived at Ravencroft Keep sweating despite the cold, asked to speak with the Duchess privately. Seraphine received him in the small eastern study she had claimed as her workspace. Lucien joined them at her gesture. They were partners now. No more secrets, no more separation of information. The functionary placed a bundle of intercepted letters on the desk. His hands shook. "Your Grace, these were routed through false diplomatic channels. They should never have crossed my desk." But the courier got drunk and confused the sorting codes. Seraphine opened the first letter, read 3 lines, then looked at Lucien with an expression that made his blood turn cold. She passed it across the desk without speaking. Lucien read the elegant handwriting, recognized it immediately. His mother. The letter was addressed to Duke Magnus Viridian. The contents were strategic, detailed, catastrophic. Octavia had been coordinating with Magnus for months. Not after his failed invasion, before it. She had helped plan the assault, had provided intelligence about Ravencroft's defenses, had suggested timing and tactics, and now she was preparing something worse. The second letter made the scope clear. Octavia had assembled a coalition of noble houses who viewed Ravencroft's reforms as existential threat to traditional power structures. They were not planning another border skirmish or political challenge. They were planning total annihilation. The target date was 2 weeks away. During the Festival of Ascension, when half of Ravencroft's forces would be dispersed across the duchy, providing security for public celebrations. The attack would come from 4 directions simultaneously: Magnus from the north, Duke Alderon from the east, Duchess Matthias from the south, and a mercenary company funded by Octavia from the west. The goal was not territorial acquisition. It was complete destruction of the civilian council model before other duchies could adopt it. They would raise the schools, execute council members publicly, install traditional governance through overwhelming military force, and they would kill anyone who resisted. including Lucien and Seraphine. The functionary watched them read with terrified eyes. "I could be executed for bringing this to you," he whispered. "Interfering with noble correspondence is treason." Seraphine looked up. "You just saved this duchy, possibly the empire. That is not treason. That is heroism. What do you need from me, Your Grace?" Silence. "For now. If the conspiracy discovers we know, they will accelerate the timeline. We need those 2 weeks to prepare." The man nodded, bowed, then hurried out of Ravencroft Keep like he was escaping a collapsing building. Lucien and Seraphine sat in silence, staring at the evidence of his mother's betrayal spread across the desk. When Seraphine finally spoke, her voice was steady, clinical. The tone she used when managing crisis. "She is trying to kill us. Your own mother is coordinating our assassination." Lucian felt something fracture in his chest, the last fragile connection to the woman who raised him. The final hope that somewhere beneath Octavia's ruthlessness existed maternal affection. "She believes she is saving House Ravencroft," he said quietly. "From me, from what I have become." By murdering her own son? Octavia does not think in terms of family. She thinks in terms of legacy, and she has decided, "I am destroying that legacy." Seraphine stood, walked to the window, stared out at the duchy they had rebuilt together over the past months. "We have 2 weeks to survive what is coming. 2 weeks to prepare for coordinated assault from 4 different armies. How do we fight that?" Lucien studied the letters again, the troop numbers, the coordination schedules, the supply routes, and slowly, through the pain of maternal betrayal and the terror of impending destruction, a strategy began forming. It was brutal, desperate, the kind of plan that only worked if everyone involved was willing to risk everything simultaneously. The kind of plan the old Lucian would have executed without hesitation. But the new Lucian understood something the old version never learned, that the most dangerous weapon is not the one your enemy expects. It is the one they have convinced themselves you would never use. "We do not fight them," Lucian said. Seraphine turned. "What?" "We do not fight them the way they expect. They are preparing for military confrontation. Traditional warfare. Duke Ravencroft defending his territory through overwhelming force. Then what do? We use the only advantage they cannot counter. Truth." Lucien stood, started pacing, the momentum of the idea building. "Every noble house in that coalition believes their conspiracy is secret. They think we do not know about the coordination, the timing, the scale. They are moving in shadow, assuming we will be blind until the attack begins. And if we expose them?" Seraphine's eyes widened as she understood. "If we expose them before the attack, the Emperor will have to intervene. They will be committing treason publicly rather than justifying military action after conquest." "Exactly. But we cannot just send the letters to the Imperial court. Magnus will claim they are forgeries, that we fabricated evidence to discredit rivals. Then how do we prove authenticity?" Lucien smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "We force them to confirm it themselves." Over the next 10 days, Ravencroft executed the most delicate political operation in its history. Lucian sent carefully worded letters to each member of the conspiracy, letters that appeared to come from other conspirators, each one containing small inaccuracies about timing or troop placement. The goal was simple: force them to correct the errors through their existing communication channels. Create a paper trail that confirmed the conspiracy's existence through their own correspondence. It required perfect forgery, precise understanding of each noble's writing style and strategic thinking. One mistake would alert them that their security was compromised. Seraphine worked 18-hour days coordinating the operation. She knew these nobles, had studied them for years during her time managing Ravencroft's political relationships. She understood their egos and insecurities and the specific phrases they used when they thought no one important was listening. The first response came from Duke Alderon, a terse correction about supply routes sent through the same corrupted postal channels. The second from Duchess Matthias, irritation about coordination schedules. The third from Magnus himself, arrogant certainty about troop numbers and attack vectors. Each response was intercepted, copied, documented. Within a week, they had assembled irrefutable evidence of coordinated treason involving 4 major noble houses and the Dowager Duchess of Ravencroft. Lucian stared at the compiled documentation, feeling something he had not experienced in months. The old familiar rage, the kind that preceded violence and destruction.
Because his mother had not just betrayed him, she had endangered Seraphine, their son, every person in Ravencroft who had trusted the reforms. And for the first time since his transformation began, Lucian wanted to hurt someone the way the Iron Wolf used to hurt people. Seraphine found him in the study at midnight. He was standing at the window with his hands clenched into fists, every muscle tight with barely controlled fury. She did not speak, just stood beside him, close enough that he could feel her presence. "I want to destroy her," Lucien said finally. "I want to expose her before the Imperial court so thoroughly that her name becomes synonymous with treason. I want her to lose everything the way she tried to make me lose everything." "I know. Is that wrong? After what she planned?" Seraphine was quiet for a moment. "No, it is not wrong. It is human. She tried to have us killed. Rage is appropriate, but you are not just human anymore. You are a duke, and dukes do not have the luxury of acting on every justified emotion." Lucien turned to face her. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that destroying your mother might feel satisfying, but it will also create complications. She has allies, sympathizers, noble houses who agree with her philosophy even if they did not participate in this specific conspiracy. If you annihilate her publicly, you risk creating a martyr. Then what do I do? Let her escape consequences? No. You give her a choice." Seraphine moved closer, placed one hand on his chest, right over his heart. "You offer her the same thing you offered yourself, the chance to transform or self-destruct. You put the evidence before her privately. You tell her that she can confess her involvement and accept exile, or you will expose everything and let the Emperor decide her fate. She will never choose exile willingly. Then she will choose execution. But you will have given her the option. And that is what separates reformed leadership from tyranny. The willingness to offer mercy even when vengeance would be easier." Lucien stared at his wife. This woman who had every reason to demand Octavia's destruction, but was advocating for measured response instead. "How are you this strong?" "I am not strong. I am strategic. Octavia alive in exile cannot rally opposition. Octavia dead becomes a symbol for traditional nobles to unite against us. I want her neutralized, Lucian. Yen, not immortalized. The logic was perfect, brutal in its calculation, and completely correct. "Fine," Lucien said, "we offer the choice, but if she refuses, I will not protect her from consequences." Agreed. They stood together in the darkness, listening to the castle settle around them. Somewhere beyond these walls, 4 armies were preparing to destroy everything they had built. And inside these walls, 2 people who had learned partnership through catastrophic failure were preparing to defend it through methods their enemies would never anticipate. Because the thing about transformation is that it does not make you weaker. It makes you unpredictable. And unpredictable is the most dangerous thing a leader can be. The confrontation with Octavia happened in neutral territory, a tavern in the border town of Crosshaven, private room on the 2nd floor. Lucien arrived first, Seraphine beside him, Minister Aldrich waiting downstairs with 20 armed guards disguised as regular patrons. Octavia entered exactly on time. She wore traveling clothes that suggested she had been preparing to leave Imperial territory entirely once the conspiracy succeeded. She stopped when she saw Seraphine. Something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe. Or calculation. "I did not expect you to bring your wife to this meeting," she said to Lucian. "We are partners now. She knows everything. How democratic." Octavia sat across from them with the posture of someone utterly unintimidated. "I assume you requested this meeting to threaten me about something." Lucien placed the compiled evidence on the table between them. Your correspondence with Duke Magnus, Duke Alderon, Duchess Matthias, the mercenary contracts, the coordination schedules, the assassination plans. Octavia glanced at the documents without touching them. Impressive forgeries. They are authentic. We intercepted them through corrupted postal channels. Every letter confirmed through your co-conspirators' own responses. His mother smiled. That confidence of someone who believed they held advantages not yet revealed. Even if they were real, what do you intend to do with them? Present them to the Emperor? He will demand verification. Authentication processes that take months. By the time anything is confirmed, the situation will have resolved itself, one way or another. The threat was clear. Lucian leaned forward. "I am giving you a choice, Mother. Confess your involvement. Accept exile to the outer provinces.
Live out your remaining years away from imperial politics. Or I submit this evidence to the Emperor immediately and let him decide your fate." Octavia laughed. Genuine amusement. "You think I fear exile? I have estates across the empire. Resources you know nothing about. Exile is vacation with a different name. Then choose it. And we both walk away from this without further bloodshed." His mother's expression hardened. "You still do not understand, do you? This is not about me surviving or you surviving. This is about what kind of empire we leave behind." She stood, placed both hands on the table, leaned close. "Your reforms are a cancer, Lucian. They make people believe that peasants deserve voices, that civilian councils can challenge noble authority, that distributed power is somehow superior to concentrated control. If Ravencroft succeeds, every duchy in the empire will fracture. Chaos will replace order, and everything our ancestors built will collapse into democratic nonsense." Seraphine spoke for the first time. "Or perhaps a more resilient empire will emerge. One where people obey because they choose to rather than because they are terrified." Octavia turned those cold eyes on her daughter-in-law. "You truly believe that? You think common people are capable of choosing wisely? I think common people are capable of recognizing when their leaders serve them versus exploit them. And I think empires built on exploitation eventually eat themselves. Pretty philosophy. Let us see how it withstands coordinated military assault." Lucian stood slowly. "Then you choose exposure. I choose legacy. Mine, yours, House Ravencroft's. And I will protect that legacy with whatever force necessary, even if it means your death." Octavia met his eyes. "Especially if it means my death, because I will become a martyr for traditional values. And martyrs are far more powerful than living reformers." She walked to the door, paused with her hand on the frame. "You had the chance to be great, Lucian, to be remembered as the Iron Wolf who conquered through strength. Instead, you will be remembered as the fool who surrendered everything for a woman's approval." Then she was gone. Lucian sat back down. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from the effort of not pursuing his mother into the street and doing something catastrophically violent. Seraphine touched his arm. She made her choice. "Yes, and now we make ours." Minister Aldrich appeared in the doorway. "Your Grace, should we detain her?" "No. Let her return to her conspirators. She will tell them we know about the plot. They will either abandon it or accelerate the timeline. Either way, we force their hand. And if they accelerate, then we defend Ravencroft with everything we have." The evidence went to the Imperial court the next morning through formal diplomatic channels. Every document authenticated. Every letter verified through chain of custody procedures. Emperor Constantine received it personally. Within hours, imperial warrants were issued for the arrest of Duke Magnus Viridian, Duke Alderon, Duchess Matthias, and Dowager Duchess Octavia Ravencroft on charges of coordinated treason and conspiracy to commit regicide. Because attempting to assassinate a sitting duke was legally equivalent to attacking the emperor himself. The conspirators had three options: surrender peacefully, flee imperial territory, or fight. They chose to fight, because noble houses that commit to treason rarely surrender halfway through the execution. They either succeed completely or burn spectacularly. There is no middle ground. Magnus accelerated the timeline. Instead of 2 weeks, the attack came in 3 days. Ravencroft barely had time to prepare. Lucian stood in the war room surrounded by his military commanders. Maps covered every surface. Troop positions marked in different colors. The numbers were brutal. Magnus commanded 4,000 soldiers in the north. Alderon had 3,500 in the east. Matthias controlled 3,000 in the south. The mercenary company Octavia funded numbered 2,500 in the west. Total enemy forces, 13,000. Ravencroft's standing military, 6,000. The civilian council had voted emergency conscription. That added another 2,000 barely trained farmers and craftsmen willing to defend their homes. 8,000 total, against 13,000 professional soldiers attacking from 4 directions simultaneously. The mathematics of annihilation. Commander Garrett, Lucian's senior military officer, studied the maps with grim assessment. "Your Grace, we cannot hold all 4 fronts. We need to consolidate forces. Choose which territories to defend and which to sacrifice." Lucian felt the old instincts rising. The Iron Wolf calculating victory through acceptable losses. Determine which villages burned so the castle could survive.
Then Seraphine entered the war room. She had been meeting with the civilian council. Her face was pale but determined. The council requests permission to evacuate non-combatants through the southern pass before Duchess Matthias arrives. Granted, Lucian said immediately. How many can we move? Approximately 8,000 civilians, mostly children, elderly, and those unable to fight. The journey will take them into neutral territory under Duke Theron's protection. Commander Garrett frowned. Your Grace, evacuating 8,000 people requires significant military escort. That further reduces our defensive capacity. Then we reduce it. Those people are not acceptable losses. Your Grace, with respect, this is war. Civilian casualties are unacceptable, Lucian said quietly. We are fighting to prove that governance through partnership works. We cannot prove that by sacrificing the people we promised to protect. The commander opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, because he recognized something in the Duke's expression. This was not negotiable. Fine, Garrett said. We escort the civilians. But that leaves us with maybe 6,000 combat-ready soldiers against 13,000 enemies. The math does not work, Your Grace. Seraphine moved to the map, placed markers on several locations. Then it is fortunate we are not relying exclusively on mathematics. She looked at Lucian. We discussed unconventional warfare. We did. How unconventional are you willing to go? Lucian studied his wife's face, saw the calculation there. The strategic mind that had managed Ravencroft's invisible machinery for 7 years. As unconventional as necessary. Good. Because I have been coordinating with the school teachers, the tenant farmers, the merchant guilds, people the conspiracy does not consider combatants. What are you planning? Seraphine smiled. Something your mother would never anticipate. We are going to fight this war with everyone she dismissed as irrelevant. Over the next 72 hours, Ravencroft transformed into something the Empire had never seen. Not a traditional military fortress, but a whole society mobilized for survival. The school teachers became intelligence operatives. They knew every road and path and hiding place in their territories. They positioned themselves along the invasion routes, providing real-time updates about enemy movements. The tenant farmers became guerrilla fighters, not facing armies directly, but sabotaging supply lines, collapsing bridges, setting fires that forced enemy columns into disadvantageous terrain. The merchant guilds became logistical coordinators, moving food and medical supplies where they were needed, evacuating wounded, maintaining communication networks. And the civilian council became the strategic heart coordinating all of it. They did not command soldiers. They commanded the entire duchy as a single organism defending itself. It was warfare the conspirators had no framework to understand, because they believed wars were won by soldiers, by military force. They did not understand that wars are actually won by logistics, by information, by the willingness of populations to endure suffering for causes they believe in. And Ravencroft's population believed, because they had been given reasons to believe. The first attack came from the north. Magnus's forces driving hard toward the capital, expecting to overwhelm Ravencroft's defenses through sheer numerical advantage. They encountered resistance 30 miles from the border. Not soldiers. Farmers. They had collapsed every bridge across the northern river. Forced Magnus's army to find crossing points that did not exist. When the soldiers finally located fordable sections, they found those sections filled with sharpened stakes hidden beneath murky water. The advance slowed, then stopped entirely when supply wagons began exploding, not from military action, from sabotage coordinated through teacher networks who knew exactly where Magnus stored his provisions. In the east, Duke Alderon faced similar problems. His cavalry charged across open terrain expecting easy movement. Instead, they found fields laced with hidden pits and caltrops manufactured by blacksmiths loyal to Ravencroft. In the south, Duchess Matthias discovered that every guide she hired disappeared overnight. Her army wandered through territory that should have been simple to navigate, but without local knowledge, they got lost in valleys and mountains that seemed to shift around them. In the west, the mercenary company found their promised payment blocked. Octavia's financial networks had been quietly dismantled by Seraphine's merchant contacts. The mercenaries received word that their employer could not pay. They hesitated, then withdrew entirely. Because mercenaries fight for money, not principles. Within 5 days, 13,000 soldiers had been reduced to 9,000 combat-effective troops. The rest were dealing with supply problems, terrain obstacles, and the gnawing realization that they were not fighting an army. They were fighting an entire population. But 9,000 soldiers was still more than enough to destroy Ravencroft if they reached the capital simultaneously. And they were getting closer. The final defensive line formed at Blackmir Fortress, the same ruined stronghold where Lucian had confronted his mother months ago. Ravencroft's engineers had spent the past week transforming it from abandoned ruin to fortified position. They could not restore the entire structure, but they made the central keep defensible. Lucian stood on the walls beside Seraphine, watching 3 separate armies converge from different directions. Magnus from the north, Alderon from the east, Matthias from the south. Behind them, 6,000 Ravencroft soldiers prepared for what might be their final stand. The enemy forces were visible on the horizon, banners flying, armor gleaming, moving with the coordinated precision of professional military organizations. Commander Garrett approached with updated numbers. Your Grace, they will reach us by nightfall. We estimate approximately 9,000 enemy combatants. We have 6,000 defenders. Lucien nodded. Status of civilian evacuation? Complete. Everyone who could not fight is safely in neutral territory. Good. Then we hold this position. For how long, Your Grace? As long as necessary. Garrett looked at Seraphine. Your Grace, you should evacuate as well. There is still time. Seraphine's expression was iron. I stay with my husband. Your Grace, I stay. The commander bowed, then retreated to his command post. Lucian turned to his wife. You should evacuate. Garrett is right. And miss the culmination of everything we built? No, this might not end well. Seraphine touched his face. Then we fail together, as partners. They stood on those crumbling walls, holding hands, while armies approached through gathering darkness. And Lucian understood something profound about the transformation he had undergone. That true strength was not the absence of fear. It was feeling absolute terror and choosing to stand anyway because something mattered more than survival. He had once believed power came from domination. Now he knew it came from connection, from the willingness to fight beside people rather than command them from safety, from becoming someone worth dying beside. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky blood red. The armies reached the outer perimeter. And Duke Lucien Ravencroft, once the Iron Wolf who ruled through fear, now the man who learned partnership through failure, prepared to defend everything he had become. Not because he expected to win, but because some things are worth defending even when defeat seems certain. Magnus's voice echoed across the valley, amplified by some acoustic trick of the terrain. Duke Ravencroft, you are surrounded. Surrender now and I will offer terms. Lucian stepped to the wall's edge, visible to everyone below. His response carried across that bloody twilight. I have one term for you, Magnus. Withdraw now and face Imperial justice, or die here, proving that the old ways fail against people united by choice. The valley fell silent. Then Magnus laughed. The sound was chilling, so be it. Horns blared. 9,000 soldiers charged toward Blackmir Fortress from 3 directions, and on the walls 6,000 defenders prepared to meet them. The first siege of the new empire was about to begin, not over territory, not over wealth, but over the fundamental question that would determine the future. Whether power flows from fear or from trust, whether empires survive through domination or partnership, whether one Alpha Duke and his brilliant wife could prove that transformation was possible even when the entire world burned around them. The arrows began to fall like rain. The siege engines rolled into position, and as darkness swallowed the battlefield, Lucien pulled Seraphine close and whispered the only truth that mattered anymore. Whatever happens next, I love you. She kissed him, fierce and desperate, and filled with everything they had fought to build, then prove it by surviving. The enemy reached the walls, and hell came to Blackmir Fortress. The siege of Blackmir Fortress lasted 7 days. 7 days of violence so concentrated that the earth itself seemed to reject what was happening on its surface. The kind of warfare that strips away every pretense of civilization and reveals what people truly are when survival becomes the only mathematics that matters. Lucian fought alongside his soldiers rather than commanding from safety. This was not strategy. This was necessity. Because the new model of leadership he had built required him to bleed the same way his people bled, required him to stand in the same fire he asked them to endure. The old Lucien would have positioned himself on the highest tower, directing troops through messengers. preserving the commander at all costs because commanders were rare and soldiers were replaceable. But the new Lucian understood something the old version never learned, that soldiers fight harder for leaders who share their danger than for commanders who hoard safety, that the willingness to die beside your people creates bonds that outlast terror. On the third day, a section of the eastern wall collapsed under sustained bombardment from Duke Alderon's siege engines. Enemy soldiers poured through the breach like water through a broken dam. Lucian met them in this gap with 30 defenders. They fought with the desperate efficiency of people who understood that every second of resistance mattered. Every enemy delayed was another moment for engineers to shore up defenses. Every attacker killed was one less threat to the people sheltering in the inner keep. The combat was intimate, brutal, the kind where you could see the fear in your opponent's eyes before you killed them, where blood mixed with mud until the ground became slick and treacherous, where exhaustion mattered more than skill and survival depended on the willingness to keep moving when your body screamed for rest. Lucien took a sword strike across his ribs that should have been fatal. The blade glanced off bone rather than penetrating clean. He killed the soldier who wounded him, then killed 2 more before his vision started tunneling from blood loss. Commander Garrett pulled him back from the breach, got him to the medical station where field surgeons worked in conditions that made butcher shops look sanitary. The wound was stitched with thread that might have been clean once, bandaged with cloth torn from dead soldiers' uniforms. Lucian refused the poppy milk they offered for pain. He needed to stay conscious, needed to remain capable of command even if his body was failing. Seraphine found him there an hour later. She had been coordinating supply distribution in the inner keep, making sure food and water reached the defenders, ensuring the wounded received whatever care was possible. Her dress was stained with blood that was not hers. Her hair had come loose from its pins. She looked exhausted beyond anything Lucian had ever seen. She also looked magnificent, because this was who Seraphine actually was beneath the Duchess masks and political performance. Someone who ran toward crisis rather than away from it, who managed chaos through competence when everyone else descended into panic. "You are injured," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook slightly as she examined his bandages. "It is manageable." "Lucien, you nearly died. So did everyone on that wall. I am not special." Seraphine met his eyes. "Yes, you are. You are the Duke. If you fall, morale collapses. Then I will not fall." She touched his face with fingers that trembled. "You cannot promise that." "No, but I can promise to keep fighting until there is nothing left to fight with." Seraphine kissed him, soft and desperate, the kind of kiss that tastes like goodbye. "I need you to survive this," she whispered against his mouth. "We have built something worth living for. Do not throw it away on martyrdom. I am not seeking death. I am defending what we created. They're the same thing when you fight from the front." Lucien pulled her closer despite the pain in his ribs. "If I command from safety while others die for decisions I made, then everything we built becomes hypocrisy. I told these people that partnership matters, that we face crisis together. I have to mean it, even if it kills you. Especially then." Seraphine rested her forehead against his. "You have become impossibly stubborn about principles. I learned from the best." They held each other in that blood-soaked medical station while the battle raged outside. And for a moment, the war became distant. Just 2 people who had found each other through catastrophic failure, who had rebuilt themselves and each other into something neither could have become alone. Then the moment shattered. A messenger burst through the entrance. "Your Grace, Magnus is requesting parley." Lucian looked up. "What?" He sent a herald under white flag. "Says he wants to negotiate terms before more people die unnecessarily." Seraphine pulled back. "It is a trap." "Probably. But we have to hear it anyway." "Why?" "Because if there is any chance to end this without further bloodshed, we have to explore it. That is what separates us from them." They met Magnus in the valley between Blackmir Fortress and his siege lines. Neutral ground under the rules of parley. Lucian brought Commander Garrett and 20 guards. Magnus arrived with similar escort. The 2 dukes faced each other across 10 feet of scorched earth. Magnus looked worse than Lucian expected. His armor was dented. His face was gaunt. The confident predator who had orchestrated this conspiracy now resembled something cornered and desperate. "Lucien," he said without preamble, "this siege serves no one. Your fortress will fall eventually. My armies will suffer losses that weaken us against external threats.
We are destroying Imperial strength fighting each other, then withdraw and face justice. Magnus laughed without humor. Justice. You mean execution. The Emperor has already declared us traitors. There is no surrender that ends in anything but death. Then why request parley? Because I am offering you an alternative, a way for both of us to survive. Lucien waited, silent. Magnus continued. We both recognize that the Imperial system is broken, that concentrated power in the Emperor's hands creates instability. What if instead of destroying each other, we divide the Empire? You take the northern territories, I take the east. Alderaan gets the west, Matthias the south. We become independent kingdoms rather than subject duchies. You are proposing civil war, fragmentation of the Empire. I am proposing evolution. The Empire is too large for single authority. We split it into manageable pieces. Each of us governs our territories according to our own philosophies. You can implement your civilian councils. I maintain traditional hierarchy. We coexist rather than destroy each other. And the Emperor becomes a figurehead, symbolic unity with no actual power. Lucien studied Magnus carefully. This was not just desperation. This was genuine strategic thinking, the kind of offer designed to exploit the exact weakness Magnus believed Lucian possessed, the desire to preserve life, to avoid unnecessary death. It was actually clever, and it would destroy everything Lucian had fought to prove. No, Lucian said simply. Magnus's expression hardened. No? You're asking me to commit treason, to fracture the Empire to save myself. That would validate every criticism my mother made about my reforms, that they make leaders weak and self-interested. We could save thousands of lives by destroying the principle that law matters, that authority comes from legitimate sources rather than whoever has the largest army. If I accept your offer, I become the tyrant again, just a tyrant who survives, better than a corpse who died for principles no one will remember. Wrong. Principles only matter when defending them costs everything. When maintaining them is easy, they are just convenient decorations. Magnus stepped closer. His voice dropped to something almost pleading. Lucien, we were raised the same way, taught that strength means survival at any cost. Your reformation does not change your nature. Deep down, you are still the Iron Wolf, still the man who would do anything to win. You're right about what I was, but you are wrong about what I am. Then you are a fool, and fools die in wars. Perhaps, but they die as something other than what they were, and that transformation matters more than survival. Magnus stared at him for a long moment. Then the mask of negotiation fell away, revealing pure hatred underneath. Then die, reformer. Die with your principles and your peasant councils and your weakness disguised as partnership. When Blackmir falls, I will execute every council member publicly. I will burn every school. I will make sure that your transformation dies so completely that it becomes a warning rather than inspiration. He turned and walked back toward his lines. Commander Garrett moved beside Lucian. Your Grace, we could kill him now. Parley rules would be violated, but he would be dead. No. We honor the white flag even when our enemies would not. Your Grace, especially when our enemies would not. That is the entire point. They returned to the fortress, and the siege continued. By the 6th day, Blackmir's defenses were failing. The walls were breached in 3 places. Medical supplies had run out entirely. Food was reduced to whatever could be scavenged from the dead. The defenders fought with the kind of exhausted determination that comes from understanding there is no retreat, no surrender that ends in mercy. Just the choice between death fighting or death kneeling. Most chose to fight. Lucien found moments between combat to check on Seraphine. She was everywhere, distributing the last of the water, treating wounds with improvised supplies, speaking quietly to soldiers who were preparing to die. She had become the heart of the defense. The reason people kept fighting when logic said surrender was inevitable, because Seraphine made them believe their deaths would matter, that they were defending something larger than individual survival, that the schools and councils and reforms they had built would outlive the bodies that protected them. On the 7th morning, Magnus launched his final assault. Every remaining soldier, every siege engine, a coordinated attack designed to overwhelm through sheer mass. The fighting reached the inner keep. Lucian stood with the last 200 defenders in the central courtyard.
They formed a circle around the entrance to the lower levels, where the wounded and remaining civilians sheltered. This was the final stand. The mathematics were simple. 200 exhausted, wounded defenders against approximately 3,000 enemy soldiers still combat capable. There was no scenario where Ravencroft won through military force. But Lucian had stopped believing that wars were won exclusively through violence. He had learned that wars were won by making the cost of victory exceed its value, by forcing your enemy to question whether the prize was worth the blood required to seize it. Magnus's soldiers crashed into the courtyard like a human wave. The fighting became mechanical. Swing sword, block strike, step backward, repeat. No strategy beyond survival for one more second, one more breath. Lucien killed until his arms went numb, until he could no longer distinguish individual enemies, until everything became motion and blood and the desperate mathematics of endurance. Beside him, Seraphine fought with a dagger she had taken from a fallen soldier. She was not trained for combat, but she was fighting anyway because there was nowhere left to retreat. They were going to die here. Both of them knew it. But they were going to die as partners, having proven that transformation was possible even if it was not sufficient for survival. Then the horn sounded, not from Magnus's forces, from beyond the valley. Imperial horns, the sound that preceded the Emperor's personal legions. The fighting slowed, then stopped. Everyone in that blood-soaked courtyard turned toward the sound. Through the morning mist came banners, gold and crimson, the colors of Emperor Constantine himself. 5,000 Imperial soldiers marching in perfect formation. At their head rode the Emperor, 70 years old but sitting his horse like a man half that age. His presence alone commanded attention that no amount of violence could compel. The Imperial Legion flowed around Magnus's forces like water surrounding rocks, not attacking, just surrounding, making it clear that any further violence would be met with overwhelming force. The Emperor rode into the courtyard, dismounted with the assistance of his honor guard, walked past the bodies and blood and exhausted defenders until he stood before Lucian. "Duke Ravencroft," he said quietly. "You look terrible." Lucian was too exhausted for formal courtesies. "Your Imperial Majesty, your timing is impeccable. I received word of the siege 4 days ago. It took this long to mobilize the Legion and march here. I would have preferred to arrive sooner, but bureaucracy is remarkably efficient at slowing urgent matters." The Emperor looked around the courtyard, studied the defenders, the bodies, the evidence of sustained, desperate resistance. Then he turned toward where Magnus stood with his forces frozen in place. "Duke Magnus Viridian," the Emperor called out, his voice carried with surprising strength. "You are charged with treason, conspiracy to commit regicide, and unlawful military aggression against a fellow duke. You will surrender yourself and your co-conspirators immediately or face summary execution." Magnus stood utterly still, calculating, considering whether fighting the Imperial Legion was somehow preferable to certain execution. Then his shoulders slumped. He dropped his sword, raised his hands. One by one, his soldiers followed. Duke Alderon and Duchess Matthias, who had been commanding from their respective siege positions, emerged under white flag and surrendered as well. The siege was over. Ravencroft had survived. Barely. But survival was survival. Lucien felt his legs give out. He sat heavily on the blood-soaked stone. Seraphine collapsed beside him. They leaned against each other, too exhausted for words. Around them, the remaining defenders began realizing they were not going to die today. Some laughed, some cried. Most just sat down where they stood and let the shock of survival wash over them. Emperor Constantine approached Lucian and Seraphine, looked down at them with an expression that was difficult to read. "You have caused me considerable trouble, Duke Ravencroft. Apologies, Your Imperial Majesty. You implemented reforms that violated centuries of precedent. You publicly acknowledged dependence on your wife's governance. You created civilian councils that undermined traditional noble authority. You defended these innovations through unconventional warfare that my military advisors still cannot adequately explain." Lucien met the Emperor's eyes, waiting for the judgment. Constantine smiled. "You have also demonstrated that empires can evolve without collapsing, that distributed authority does not necessarily mean chaos, that people will defend governance that serves them with far more ferocity than they will defend tyranny that oppresses them." He gestured at the fortress. "This siege should have ended in 3 days. Magnus commanded overwhelming force.
Yet your defenders held for 7 days against impossible odds, not through superior military skill, but through belief that what they defended mattered. The Emperor extended his hand. Lucian stared at it, then grasped the offered hand and allowed Constantine to help him stand. I am formally recognizing Ravencroft's governance model as legitimate imperial alternative, the Emperor said. Other duchies may adopt civilian councils if they choose. Your experiment is no longer experiment. It is precedent. Lucian felt the words settle like weights. Not just survival, but validation. The transformation he had undergone was now encoded into imperial law. Thank you, Your Imperial Majesty. Do not thank me yet. You have created considerable work for yourself. Every ambitious duke in the Empire will now attempt civilian councils. Most will fail because they will implement the structure without understanding the philosophy. You will be requested to advise, to explain, to defend your model repeatedly as others attempt to discredit it through their inevitable failures. I accept that responsibility. Good. Because evolution is not a single transformation. It is continuous adaptation. You proved change is possible. Now you must prove it is sustainable. The Emperor turned to leave, paused. One more thing, Duke Ravencroft. Your mother is currently in Imperial custody. She will face trial for her role in this conspiracy. Do you wish to testify? Lucian looked at Seraphine. She nodded slightly. No, Your Imperial Majesty. I have nothing to add to the documented evidence. Whatever judgment you render will be just. Constantine studied him. You show her mercy. I show her indifference. She made her choices. I made mine. We are no longer connected by anything except unfortunate biology. The Emperor nodded. Then he mounted his horse and rode out of the courtyard. His legion began the process of taking Magnus and the other conspirators into custody. Lucian and Seraphine stood together watching Empire machinery grind into motion around them. We survived, Seraphine said quietly. We did, against every probability. Yes, what now? Lucien looked at the destroyed fortress, the exhausted defenders, the evidence of everything they had endured. Now we rebuild. Again, for the third time. And if another conspiracy emerges, then we defend again. As many times as necessary. Because that is the price of transformation. Continuous vigilance. Perpetual adaptation. The willingness to fight the same battle repeatedly until the world finally understands that the old ways are dying. Seraphine leaned against him. I am very tired of fighting. So am I. But we will do it anyway. Yes. Because some things matter more than comfort. They stood in the ruins of Blackmir fortress holding each other, while the sun climbed higher and the bodies were carried away, and the wounded were tended and the difficult work of survival continued. Around them, and Lucien understood the most profound truth about transformation, that it never ends. There is no final state where you achieve enlightenment and coast on previous evolution. There is only the continuous choice to remain committed to what you have become rather than regressing to what you were. Every day was that choice. Every crisis was that test. And he would make that choice every day for the rest of his life. Because the woman beside him deserved that consistency. The people who had fought for his reforms deserved that dedication. And the version of himself he had become deserved the respect of not being abandoned when difficulty inevitably returned. The return to Ravencroft took 2 weeks. The roads were damaged. The duchy needed time to recover from the siege and assess what had survived the conspiracy. The schools had remained open throughout the crisis. The civilian council had continued meeting. The reforms had functioned even when Lucien was absent fighting for their survival, which proved Seraphine's point from the beginning, that sustainable governance did not depend on single individuals. It required systems that functioned independent of personality. Lucien had built those systems, not alone, but in partnership with the woman who understood what he was too arrogant to see for 7 years. The duchy welcomed them home with quiet celebration. No grand ceremonies, no elaborate pageantry, just people lining the roads watching their duke and duchess return. Alive. Together. Having survived what should have destroyed them. The banners of House Ravencroft flew above the obsidian towers once again. But something fundamental had changed in what those banners represented. They no longer symbolized domination. They symbolized partnership. The willingness to evolve or die trying. Lucien stood in the same study where this entire transformation had begun. The room looked identical. Same furniture, same windows overlooking the northern mountains. But the man standing there was completely different, from the one who had humiliated his wife at a ball 18 months ago. That man had believed power came from control, that strength meant the absence of vulnerability, that love was weakness for fools who could not maintain emotional discipline. This man understood that power came from connection, that strength meant the courage to be vulnerable with people who earned that trust. That love was the most ruthless force in human experience because it required constant maintenance and offered no guarantee of return. Seraphine entered the study carrying their son. The boy had grown during the months of crisis, was walking now, talking in simple sentences. He looked at Lucian with eyes that held no memory of the tyrant his father had been, only knowledge of the man his father had become. That was grace beyond what Lucien deserved. "How are the reconstruction reports?" Seraphine asked. "Extensive. We lost approximately 40% of our military capacity. 3 villages were completely destroyed. Economic damage will take years to fully repair. But the schools? All functional. Attendance has actually increased. Parents want their children educated now more than ever." Lucian set down the reports, looked at his wife. "I have been thinking about what the Emperor said. About sustainability. About proving that transformation can endure long-term. And I want to codify the civilian council authority into permanent law. Make it constitutional, rather than dependent on ducal approval. So that even if I die or future Ravencroft rulers attempt regression, the structure remains protected." Seraphine smiled. "You want to limit your own authority legally. I want to ensure that what we built outlives us, that it becomes institutional rather than personal. That is genuinely revolutionary. That is genuinely terrifying, but necessary." They spent the next 6 months working with legal scholars and the civilian council to draft what would become the Ravencroft Charter, a document that established permanent division of authority between ducal power and civilian oversight. It was unprecedented in Imperial history. Other duchies watched with fascination and horror. Some began tentatively implementing similar structures. Others condemned it as the death of noble tradition. Emperor Constantine officially endorsed the charter, declared it a model for imperial governance evolution, and slowly, painfully, the empire began changing. Not everywhere, not quickly, but with the inexorable momentum of ideas whose time had arrived. 1 year after the siege, Lucien and Seraphine stood in the rebuilt Northern Gallery, the same location where their affair of betrayal had begun, where Celestine had seduced him into destroying his marriage. The portraits of dead Ravencroft still lined the walls, still stared down in judgment. "Do you think they approve now?" Seraphine asked. Lucien studied his ancestors, the warriors and tyrants and ruthless commanders who had built House Ravencroft through centuries of domination. "No. I think they would view everything we have done as betrayal of their legacy." "Does that bother you?" "Not anymore. Because their legacy was building empire on suffering, and empires built on suffering eventually consume themselves. We are building something different, something that might actually last because people choose to sustain it rather than being forced to endure it." Seraphine took his hand. "You have become philosophical. I have become honest. Finally. Was it worth it, everything we endured?" Lucien thought about the question, about the public humiliation, the exile, the siege, the wounds that still ached in cold weather, the nights he woke from nightmares about Blackmir Fortress. Yes, because the alternative was remaining the Iron Wolf, dying eventually as a tyrant surrounded by people who feared me but never knew me. That would have been a waste of a life. And now? Now I am something better. Not perfect, but better. And I am known by the person who matters most. He pulled Seraphine closer. "I love you. Not as possession, not as political necessity, but as genuine partnership between equals. You made me into someone capable of that, and I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of what you gave me." Seraphine kissed him, soft and certain. "You already are." They stood together in that gallery as winter snow began falling across the mountains. The duchy functioned around them. Schools educated children, councils governed fairly. People lived with the cautious trust that their leaders served rather than exploited them. It was not perfect. There were still problems, still corruption to root out, still conflicts to resolve, but it was better, measurably, demonstrably better than what existed before. And that was enough. Because transformation is not achieving perfection. It is making continuous incremental improvement. It is choosing to be slightly better today than yesterday, slightly more honest, slightly more courageous,
slightly more willing to acknowledge failure and adapt. Over time, those slight improvements compound into fundamental change, into evolution. Duke Lucien Ravencroft had evolved from predator to partner, from tyrant to servant, from the Iron Wolf to something far more dangerous to the old order. A man who proved that even the most ruthless hearts can transform if the cost of remaining unchanged exceeds the fear of becoming different. That night, Lucian sat alone in his study writing letters, not to ministers or generals or political allies, to his son, letters the boy would read when he was old enough to understand, letters explaining the choices his father made, the mistakes, the transformations, the reasons why Ravencroft was different from other duchies. The final letter was simple. My son, by the time you read this, you will have heard stories about who I was, the Iron Wolf, the tyrant who ruled through fear. Those stories are true. I was that man. I hurt people. I destroyed lives for political advantage. I treated human beings as resources to be exploited rather than citizens to be served. Your mother changed me, not through gentleness or patience, though she possessed both, but through the radical act of leaving when I made her existence unbearable. She showed me that real strength is not domination, it is partnership. That true power comes not from forcing compliance, but from earning trust. I tell you this not to excuse what I was, but to show you that transformation is possible, that you are not imprisoned by your worst instincts, that you can choose to become better than what you were born to be. Govern Ravencroft with wisdom, serve your people rather than ruling them. Remember that authority is temporary, but impact is permanent. And most importantly, find someone who sees you clearly, who loves you enough to demand you become your best self, who will leave if you fail to meet that standard. Then spend your life being worthy of that person. That is the only empire worth building. Your father, Lucien Ravencroft. He sealed the letter, placed it with the others in the safe where they would wait until needed. Then he walked upstairs to the bedroom where Seraphine was already sleeping. He lay beside her, careful not to wake her, watching her breathe in the moonlight filtering through the windows. This woman had saved him, not through rescue, but through refusal, through the willingness to walk away from a prison disguised as marriage, through demanding that he become someone worthy of partnership rather than accepting the tyrant he had been. That was love in its most ruthless form, not acceptance of flaws, but insistence on growth, not comfort, but challenge, not possession, but mutual evolution. Lucian closed his eyes, let exhaustion pull him toward sleep, and in that space between waking and dreams, he understood the final truth about transformation, that it is never complete. There is no finish line where you achieve permanent enlightenment. There is only the daily choice to remain committed to what you have become, to resist the gravity of old patterns, to choose partnership over domination even when domination would be easier. Every day was that choice, every moment was that test, and he would make that choice every day for the rest of his life, because the alternative was unacceptable. The alternative was becoming the Iron Wolf again. And that man was dead, buried beneath the rubble of Blackmir Fortress, replaced by someone better, someone worthy of the woman sleeping beside him. Someone who finally understood that the greatest empire any person can build is the one they construct with a partner who demands their best self. That empire cannot be conquered, cannot be destroyed by external force, can only be maintained through continuous choice. And Lucien Ravencroft would make that choice every morning for the rest of his days. Because love is not a feeling that arrives unbidden and sustains itself through magic. Love is a decision, remade constantly, in small moments and large crises. In the willingness to transform when transformation is the only alternative to destruction. In the courage to admit failure and rebuild from honesty rather than pride. In the radical act of choosing partnership when domination would be simpler. Outside, snow fell across Ravencroft, covering the scars of war, blanketing the duchy in quiet white. Inside the castle, the Duke and Duchess slept peacefully, partners in governance, partners in life, partners in the continuous work of becoming people worthy of the empire they were building together. And throughout the territory they protected, people went to sleep with the cautious trust that their leaders would choose service over exploitation, would choose partnership over domination, would choose evolution over regression, not because leaders were inherently good, but because the people had learned to demand it, to hold authority accountable, to recognize that true power flows from consent rather than coercion. That was the real revolution, not one duke's transformation, but an entire duchy learning that they deserved better than tyranny, and being willing to fight for that standard, even when the cost was nearly everything, especially then, because some truths are only learned through catastrophe. Some transformations only happen when the alternative is annihilation, and some empires are only built after everything false has burned away, leaving only what is real, what is earned, what is worth defending with everything you have. Ravencroft had become that empire, and the Duke who once ruled through fear now governed through partnership. Not because he was perfect, but because he was finally honest. And honesty, sustained over time with people who demand your best self, is the most revolutionary force in human experience. That was the lesson Lucien Ravencroft learned the hardest way possible, by losing everything, by nearly dying for it, by discovering that what he rebuilt was infinitely more valuable than what he destroyed, and by spending the rest of his life proving that transformation was not temporary performance, but permanent evolution. The kind that changes not just individuals, but entire worlds.